Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Rachel and I'm from Atlanta, which is a bustling, vibrant, diverse city situated among the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains at 1,050 feet above sea level, which is the highest elevation among major cities east of the Mississippi River. It is often referred to as the Big Peach or the City in the Forest, and is the capital and most populated city in the state of Georgia. Atlanta is well known for its award-winning restaurants, art and culture. I happily reside here in a leafy green neighbourhood where I live in a very attractive area north of downtown Atlanta known as Chastain Park with my fun-loving parents and my studious older brother Neil. We live in an elegantly restored old Tudor-style home with a very sizable front and back yard, which is lined with sumptuous green turf, a scattering of pretty trees, and a few colourful flower beds filled with seasonal flowers. My strange, rather incredulous, outlandish Bigfoot story begins in a way that I never imagined possible, for indeed I never considered that a Bigfoot story would ever cross my path, and certainly not in the way that it did. As invariably you always assume that a Bigfoot encounter is rather like the lottery, which means I never thought I would actually hit the jackpot myself. Well, certainly not in quite the way that I did. It all began when the COVID-19 pandemic broke around the world, which made my mother become unduly alarmed about my grandmother, who was in her 80s. At the time, she'd been living in a residential care home where a few people had suddenly just died from COVID. My mother thought that my grandmother might be predisposed and vulnerable to the virus given her age, fragility and weakened immune system, which was why she was desirous for her to move into our house forthwith, an idea that was exceedingly unbecoming to my father, who became very aggrieved and indignant about such a horrifying prospect. For a while, our normally tranquil, peace-loving home became rather like a war zone, where the verbal battles ensued in our sofa-covered living room and carpeted home. As my parents argued incessantly, my obstinate, pertinacious mother invariably always seemed to get her way in the end, and so for a couple of days our house descended into darkness as my sullen father sulked in the corner, barely saying a single word, while my mother prepared the spare room on the first floor of our home for my elderly grandmother Ruth. Within 2 days she'd moved into our home. My grandmother Ruth is a very sweet, frail, elderly woman who's actually as sharp as a hawk and incredibly observant, yet at the same time she's as gentle as a doe. I've always warmed to her because she is such a gentle, warm-hearted and congenial sort of person, and yet at the very same time humorous as well. I remember when I was helping her unpack in her bedroom, she actually said to me, "Oh, I hope I'm not going to be an inconvenience for you all. I can see that your father isn't very happy to have me around, and I can't say I really blame him for that. This is all very awkward for all of us." "Don't worry about him, Granny," I said, giving her a reassuring hug. "Dad's just very set in his ways, that's all. He finds it rather difficult to adjust to different living circumstances. I wouldn't worry about it at all if I was you. He just needs to acclimatise to having you around. And once he's adjusted, he'll be fine, I promise you of that. I know what he's like." "Oh, I hope you're right," chided my grandmother, looking more than a little doubtful. I began to help my grandmother unpack, while she sat back on a comfortable chair, watching me and directing me as to where to put her various things. Before long, I was placing her neatly folded clothes into various drawers and hanging up all her pretty dresses and coats. I was about to put this long cardboard box into the cupboard when I discerned that it was full of these most magnificent drawings. "Granny," I said in shock, putting the box onto the bed and going through the pictures in awe. "These pictures are absolutely incredible. The colours are marvellous, and the drawings are exquisite. Did you draw these?" I asked. "They're stunning." "Yes, I did. When I was a young girl. Well, some of them anyway. Not all of them." "I never knew you were an artist," I said, sifting through the pictures very briefly. "You certainly know how to keep your light hidden under a bushel, Granny. You're a real talent, if ever I saw one." My grandmother chuckled. "That's very kind of you to say so, dear. In those days I enjoyed drawing a great deal. I was a young girl then. It was one thing I could always do that didn't break the bank for my family. We were very poor back then." I sat down on the bed in my grandmother's bedroom and glanced through the pictures very briefly that she had drawn. Some were of her home, the pretty countryside, and even her family. And then there was another picture that caused the hair on the back of my head to stand on end, and my eyes to grow round as saucers, and my jaw to drop to the ground. My grandmother had drawn the perfect picture of a Sasquatch or a Bigfoot. How could she even have known about such a creature, I pondered. I was absolutely stumped. "What's wrong, dear?" she asked, her voice expressing concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Your skin has grown as white as a sheet." "Granny," I said, waving the picture of the Bigfoot towards her, "what's this that you've drawn here?" My grandmother giggled. "Oh, that's Mops. Well, that's what my mother used to call him when I was growing up, because his rag-tailed hair looked like a mop. It was long and shaggy. He was a funny old thing, really." "You mean you knew this creature?" I asked, looking absolutely amazed. I sat down on her bed and insisted my grandmother told me the entire story from start to finish. So this is what she told me in her own words, which I now reveal to you. "Well, dear," she proceeded to tell me, "I grew up in the late Depression in the Appalachian, Kentucky area that stretches from Alabama to southern Pennsylvania. It was in the 1930s, and those grueling times were very hard indeed for the all of us, as there was very little employment back then due to the 1929 stock market crash, inexperienced Federal Reserve, and ill-timed tariffs, all collectively contributing to the ailing economy at the time. In those days we had to be very diligent and prudent and learn to survive, and that's what we did back then. We industrially grew our own vegetables and bottled and preserved them for the winter months. We raised chickens for eggs and we had a goat for milk. You really didn't have a choice in the matter, even if you wanted to. We were very frugal in those days, and we had a saying, use it up, wear it out, make do or go without. As a child, I'd scamper around the open wilderness in my bare feet, as shoes then were so expensive and my parents couldn't afford to buy me any. I never owned a pair of my own for a very long time. I would end up getting bitten by insects or spiky thorns would get embedded into my feet. But one day my father used the skins from a dead animal to make me a pair of boots, and that changed my life for the better, as he was a very resourceful man, and I still say to this very day that those boots were the very best I've ever owned. Even though things were very tough and Spartan in those days, I had a beautiful, idyllic and magical childhood, and when you're young and innocent, you believe that the thrifty, provident way that you live is perfectly normal, because you don't know any better. You think that being frugal and penny-wise is the natural way to survive, not like it is today, dear, where there is just so much wastage in absolutely everything. It wasn't like that then. In those days we lived on meagre scant offerings, and we would eat potatoes with onions and hot dogs to fill up, or other cheap foods like beans, brown rice, oats and canned tuna or salmon, or sometimes mac and cheese. I remember one of my favourite foods was biscuits with creamed salmon. We lived in a very small rustic wooden cabin where we shared one queen-size bed together, which was occupied by both of my parents, my older brother Larry, and then me, of course. We would all have to squeeze together in one bed, but during the winter months it was very snug because we would keep each other incredibly warm. As a kid, I loved playing in the wilderness, the vast open prairies, the streams, and the heavily wooded areas on our land. Growing up, Mops was a very normal part of my young life, and I played with him all the time. Of course, he was physically different to me, but when you're young, you accept people at face value and respect them the way they are, without considering their physical differences as strange or peculiar. Indeed, I never thought of such matters in regards to Mops. Granted, he was covered in long flowing brown hair, and he had feet that were padded at the bottom like a cat's, which I used to envy because he'd never get thorns in his feet or anything like that. He was able to run over the rough terrain and even on the snow with ease without getting his feet all cold. He was a creature of few words, but that really didn't matter to me. But he did speak to his mother in a chattering language, which I always found incredibly funny. When I was 10 years old, Mops was already about 5 foot tall and very heavy and stockily built. Not that that ever bothered me at the time. His height or his size was never an issue for me. Sometimes his height was a huge advantage for me, because he could reach the fruit on the trees that I couldn't get to, like peaches and apples, which was great, or biscuits that my mother had hidden from us on the top shelf of the pantry. We would play hide and seek, and Mops could hide in plain sight, and I'd never be able to find him. He was great at just vanishing into thin air, and he loved it when I couldn't discover his hiding spot. It used to drive me completely potty, so eventually he made himself a little easier to find, or I'd have given up on that game in a heartbeat. Yes, but I don't understand is how Mops just became a part of your family and your life in the first place. Well, that's another story, dear. I must have been about 2 years old, and my mother had placed me in a playpen outside my quaint little rustic cabin. It was like a fenced-in area that my father had made out of wooden pegs to keep me contained. In those days they could not afford toys, but my parents would put pine cones into the playpen and interesting pieces of driftwood, along with paper and crayons for me to play with, and I would be entertained while my mother cleaned out the house, always keeping her steely eyes pinned on me. One day when my mother came out into the yard to attend to my needs, she discovered little Mops had been placed in the playpen next to me. We were playing together very happily, like a couple of naughty juvenile toddlers, although Mops was physically bigger than me at the time. My mother was rather surprised and bewildered to see Mops in the playpen, and she wisely speculated that he was indeed the child of the wild woman, and instinctively sensed she needed her to babysit Mops, so that's exactly what she did. The wild woman would come and collect Mops later in the day, although she was never observed doing so by my mother. I think my mother was secretly pleased that I had a companion to play with, which meant I would get up to less mischief and was kept preoccupied by my little friend. I do remember she scrubbed Mops down a few times with a scrubbing brush and plenty of soap, and brushed out all the knots in his hair with a hairbrush, and he screamed blue murder like a baby because it hurt so much when my mother worked on all those tangles of his. After that fiasco, Mops was always wary of my mother, and when she came after him with a hairbrush, he would run and hide. He was so terrified of that thing, and if he saw a hairbrush, he would start to tremble and wobble like a jelly. If my mother ever wanted Mops to leave the house, all she had to do was wave that hairbrush at him, and he would vanish from sight, and we wouldn't see him for the rest of the day. Every time she upset Mops, he would spray the wall like a domestic cat in revenge and leave the most pungent odour behind in our house that would literally burn the back of your throats and hurt your eyes. It was a putrid smell, rather like hot garbage, and my mother hated it. Did your mother know this wild woman? I asked. No, you see, the introverted wild woman was very reticent, evasive and bashful, but my mother had seen her in passing in the wood green, and their eyes met on many occasions. I think she liked the timorous wild woman and understood her diffidence better than most. You see, growing up, my mother herself had been painfully shy, so she rarely related to the demure wild woman. I know she spotted her capricious elderly partner once or twice in the forest, whom she described as a very sizable, fractious old fellow, whom she believed was a little cantankerous, grouchy and rather moody. You could tell he was old, as his grey hair was turning white, and his leathery weathered grey face looked literally ancient and shriveled up like a wizened old tortoise. That was how wrinkled he was. She perceived that the wild woman brought Mops to play with me so that his mischievous games and animated high-pitched whoops would not upset and unnerve the cranky, crotchety old fellow. I do remember when I was playing in the sylvan with Mops, the crusty old fellow heard us as we were chasing each other around the grove. I was shrieking wildly with laughter, and Mops was whooping in delight because he perceived that I'd never catch him, as Mops could run like the wind. I've never seen anything that could run that fast. I will never forget the petulant old fellow who'd been watching us sternly with angry eyes. He lunged towards me, shaking his gargantuan fists at me in a furious rage, and he began to scream so loudly that he sounded like a woman being murdered. Then he curled back his lips and unleashed the most terrifying growl and leered at me with his hostile eyes. I could tell that he was incandescent with rage, which caused my whole body to shake like a leaf. I was certain in that moment that the quick-tempered old man was about to hit me really hard, but that was when the unassuming wild woman came to my immediate rescue. She ushered the old man away, talking to him very softly in a chattering tone that seemed to calm him down. I always got the impression that Mops kept a safe distance from the narky old fellow, as I think he was fickle at the very best of times. He was a scary individual. He was thickly built like an army tank, and was easily over 8 foot tall, and even more than 700 pounds, and possibly 3 foot wide. Over the years, the magnanimous wild woman brought my family generous open-handed gifts of deers, hogs, rabbits, fish, and other food sources in exchange for taking care of Mops. We would discover these bountiful trophies on our front door, along with a bucket of wild berries or fruits from time to time, which my mother would bottle or make into delicious jams. As far as my parents were concerned, looking after Mops was a lifesaver for our family. It was like earning a very decent, highly desirable wage package, because it meant we had meat every single day of our lives, which alleviated our hunger pangs and satiated us considerably. It would seem that life became a great deal better and easier for us in our home, because we all went to bed with full satisfied stomachs, thanks to the wild woman, and we were healthier too. My father, whom had never been best pleased about my relationship with Mops and thought it was a bit unusual, shut up after the meat kept arriving on our doorstep, let me tell you that. Whereabouts did Mops live? I asked. Well, he lived in the woods in a cave with his mother and dad. I remember he showed me the place once when we were playing in the grove. You would never have known it was even there. It was concealed by thick brush and thicket, and it was fully protected from all the elements. It was a cosy, sumptuous den, lined with lots of animal pelts and tree stumps and so forth. So how long were you friends with Mops? I asked. I think I was about 12 years old when Mops and his mother went away to pastures new, because they were, like nomads, following waterways, railway lines and animal trails, as that's how the wild men in those days lived. I think the only reason they stayed in our vicinity for so long is because of the grumpy old man, who was tired and weary and incapacitated by his leg that appeared to give him a great deal of trouble. He would drag it on the ground behind him. My mother believed it had once been caught in a trap before and had given him a great deal of grief ever since. She thought that he might have insufferable pain, which could have accounted for his volatile temper. Of course, when he died, everything changed after that. It was a very sad, grievous time for the all of us. Even my father missed the free meat deliveries at our front doorstep, and life went downhill from then on, as we had to resort to living on beans and rice, and it wasn't easy, let me tell you. How did the old man die? I asked. Well, I remember one day the wild woman beckoned to my mother and indicated for her to follow her, which was a very big deal for us because she was desperately shy, and although she would make her presence known, she liked to remain hidden in the shadows. We barely ever saw her unless she crossed our path and glanced at us ever so briefly. On this occasion, however, the wild woman stepped out of her comfort zone, which wasn't easy for her at all, and she led my mother to the open grave that she had dug in the grove, only yards away from where the cave was where the family lived. I remember getting such a shock when I observed the old man lying next to the open grave, with his deceased body. It was so withered. I could see that despite his great size and girth, he was emaciated and drawn. I'd never seen a dead body before that, and in my eyes he was very human to me, despite all the hair and his gargantuan size. I must say he looked very peaceful in death. My mother believed he'd died in his sleep or something, and you could see that the wild woman loved him so very much. I could discern the distress in her eyes, and how desperately sad she was. I remember my mother took the wild woman into her arms, and they locked in a warm embrace. She patted her gently on her hair-covered back, and she kept saying, "I'm so sorry, you poor, poor thing. It must be very hard for the both of you." The wild woman really looked comforted by my mother's kind, gentle words, and the compassion that she showed her. I could tell that she loved my mother very much, even though they had so little contact. She patted my mother's back as well. It was an emotional, loving embrace. Was Mop sad about his dad's death? No, not really. I think he was actually rather relieved, to tell you the truth. I sensed his fractious relationship with his father was combustible at the very best of times. I think the poor old man possibly found Mops rather too rambunctious and feisty for his liking. So what happened next? Well, the wild woman buried the old man while we all watched the procedure. It was really rather peculiar, but she wanted to include us in the ceremony, and I realised then that she considered us a huge part of her life, which was incredibly moving, especially for my mother, who was touched to the quick. I noticed Mama was actually crying when the old man was buried. I think she was so sad for the wild woman. Once the old man was buried, the wild woman put some sticks into the ground to mark the grave, and then she let out the most appallingly loud howls. I even began to weep when she howled, because you could feel her desperate pain. And then once she'd finished grieving, she pointed towards the east, and my mother knew that they were leaving and moving on. We were all grievously sad, and said our goodbyes. I remember we patted each other on the backs and nodded, and I just wept and wept when I saw them go. It really felt like a death and a dreadful loss. I was so sad. I remember after they left, life got really hard again. Obviously, we no longer had the meat deliveries from the wild woman, and I missed Mop so much. He had been my very best friend growing up. I never stopped crying for days. I used to beg God to bring him back to us, but he and his mother, they never returned. I begged God to make them return, but it just never happened. My mother believed that the wild woman, who was still very young at the time, had possibly found a new love. My mother was so sad. She told me she never realised how much the wild people had impacted her life. We always went to the grave of the old man and prayed for him and laid down flowers for him on the anniversary of his death every single year. Wow, I said, what a story! I said this looking at the picture my gran had painted of the critter with a pyramid-shaped head, overlong arms and hair-covered body. As my grandmother looked at the picture, I could see the tears welling in her eyes and streaking and falling down her cheeks as she remembered little Mops. "So this is Mops," I said, studying the picture. "It's a really good picture. He looks really sweet. His eyes look very kind." My grandmother was still crying, wiping away her tears. "Oh, he was kind," she said, "very kind." "And if you think that's a good picture," she said, "look at these." My grandmother showed me some other pictures that had been meticulously done by a fine artist. "Who did these?" "These were done by Mops." "Mops drew these pictures?" I asked in astonishment. My grandmother nodded. "He was a great artist, and we would draw together for hours. He was far better than me. He knew how to draw the natural world. You see, he knew it so much better than I did." "That's extraordinary," I said. "He was such a phenomenal artist. I can't believe it." Suddenly I remembered the picture from the Patterson-Gimlin footage, and I took out my mobile phone and showed the footage to my grandmother. I wanted to see what she thought of the creature that many have speculated for so long and wondered if it was real. "What do you think of this footage, Granny?" I asked. "That looks a lot like the wild woman," said my grandmother, "only she was much taller and slimmer. But she did look like that. It's a great footage," she said, "and it's definitely real. It's not fake. You can see the muscles moving under the arms, and you can see the areas where the animal doesn't have hair. That was similar to the wild woman, As you can imagine, I was thrilled that my grandmother could share the story with me, and if she had not stayed in our home, I would never have known about her encounter with the hairy man. I told my grandmother that the critters are known as Bigfoot, but she said Mops and the Wild Woman were like people to her, but people with hair and pyramid-shaped faces and very powerful, strong bodies. But they're just like us, she told us, with emotions and feelings. Don't ever forget that. You cannot say they're animals because they're intelligent and discerning. I did tell her that some people had terrifying encounters with the critters, and she believes that they are actually misunderstood. They do have an intrinsic ability to read your mind, she did tell me. I do know Mops was always able to know what I was thinking. And that was proven one day when we played a game where I'd draw a picture on a piece of paper and he had to guess what I'd drawn. And he always got it right. If I drew an apple or a house, he drew exactly what I'd drawn. So he was very, very telepathic. I imagine if a hunter was thinking I'm going to kill this wild man, he would be in pretty much big trouble, because the wild man would already have perceived his thoughts and quickly defend himself. Also, if you display fear, that would be a red flag to a wild man. You see, the wild man would see your fear as an invitation to attack, as all the other animals they hunt are afraid of them as well. But do you believe that there are bad wild men? Of course I do, just as there are bad men in our world. It really is not much different than that. The problem is if you're dealing with an aggressive wild man, you'll be in big trouble because they're colossal, dangerous, and they'll kill you in a heartbeat. My grandmother still lives in our house to this day, and my father has warmed to her considerably because she's a very likeable old lady. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Heather. Well, it's not rarely, of course, but that's what I'll call myself for the purposes of this story, as I need to keep personal details, such as my name and specific locations, as obscure and inconspicuous as possible, if you don't mind. That is to ensure that I don't end up getting fired from my job, or worse still, being labelled and vilified for being completely off my head, or categorised as completely bonkers, especially after I share my extraordinary Bigfoot encounters with you. I very much doubt that the people at my workplace would ever believe in this incredulous, seemingly fictitious creature that we call Bigfoot, for it would seem that many epitomise such an outlandish critter to be the stuff of fables, legends and myths. But those of us who have encountered this idiosyncratic, anomalous creature, we know that he's real. I presently live in California, which is on the west coast of the United States, and I live in an apartment in downtown Los Angeles. But I grew up in an area in the northernmost coastal part of California, on the Oregon border, about a 6-hour drive from North San Francisco, in close proximity to the Redwood National Park in Humboldt County and Del Norte County, which is home to the tallest, most magnificent trees in the world, and many resplendent areas of national forest. My strange, rather curious story that ultimately led to my Bigfoot encounter begins when I was working for a Glossy magazine in Los Angeles. I ended up being summoned into my boss's office, and I could tell by the somewhat irked, vanquished expression on her angular, fair-skinned face that she was far from pleased with me. My boss at the time was a tall, platinum, thin blonde woman in her early 50s, who had as many plastic surgeries as you and I have eaten hot dinners. For if you can improve on nature with the surgeon's instrument, then why not? And she would be first in line to go under the knife, so to speak. I think she lived on copious amounts of coffee for sustenance and energy, for indeed I had never seen her eat a single day in the 12 years of working for that magazine. I know she's petrified of carbohydrates and used to run away from them in terror like you and I would flee from a predator. For her, the very idea of putting on a single ounce of weight was so soul-destroying and distressing. It's pretty much like that among all the people where I work, who are so focused on their physical appearance that they never consider for a moment that they're so much more than just their physical bodies. I wish with all my heart they would realise this about themselves. I will say this about my colleagues at work, and that they're among the saddest, most disconnected people I've ever met, as the superficial world they inhabit in their own heads has literally robbed them of any real meaningful joy. They will go to extreme lengths to delay the aging process as much as they possibly can. It would seem that age for them is a very ugly, repugnant, repellent and hideously foul word that should be hastily brushed under the carpet as any discussion on the matter invariably brings out the proverbial hornet's nest of dread, so to speak. Anyway, back to my boss, whom I will call Irma. "I'm not pleased with you, Heather," she said, eyeing me through her glamorous bright purple vintage glasses with a distinct look of displeasure on her face. "Sorry," I explained. "What exactly is the problem? Don't you like the article I wrote about our client's long struggle with substance abuse?" "I have no problem with the article that you've written. In fact, I would say it's exemplary and impeccable, and of the highest standard. But I do have a big problem with these." She began tossing all the photographs at me, rather like she was shooting a confetti gun, where they landed haphazardly on the table and the floor. These poignant photographs were actually taken on a photo shoot of a well-known celebrity that I'd interviewed for the purposes of the magazine. "What's wrong with the pictures?" I said, picking a few of them off the floor to examine them closely. "This is what I think of them," said Irma, using her long pink talons to shred the pictures into pieces so that they looked like they'd been through a shredding machine. "I don't understand," I said, looking rather perturbed. "These pictures are absolutely amazing. They're real and authentic. Our readers can really relate to the challenges that the celebrity has faced during her life. I think they can identify with her. Look at the sad look in her eyes, rimmed by these dark shadows, and look at the lines on her face and the crepey pale skin. Don't you think they paint a vivid picture of how tough things have been for her of late?" "Heather," snapped Irma, "we are a glossy magazine, for goodness sake. Our readers don't want to see dark circles and lines under the eyes. Our readers want to see a flawless, smooth complexion. They want to see a perfect smile, a beautiful countenance. Is that so hard for you to understand?" "I don't think that's entirely true," I said. "I don't think people are that shallow." "Oh, but they are, dear. People love glamour, and that's what we give them in our magazine. It's a form of escapism." She continued, "I understand you refuse the makeup artist permission to glamorize our celebrity. Why on earth would you do that? What on earth were you thinking? Look how dreadful she looks in these photographs. I mean, her fair skin looks pale and pasty. Her blue eyes look as if she's been in the boxing ring with Mike Tyson. And as for the rugged texture of her deplorable skin, you could literally make purses out of it. Do you really blazonly believe people want to see pictures of celebrities looking like this?" "So do you want me to go back to get some more photographs of her?" I suggested, looking for a quick way to redeem myself from this very sticky situation, and to somehow appease Irma, who looked so angry. "That will not be necessary, dear. But just so you know, I will never, ever publish photographs like this. Do you understand? Never, never. They're quite horrific. I'll be getting them airbrushed as usual. We'll be bringing some colour back into her face and eliminating these horrendous shadows beneath her eyes. But more to the point, I still don't get what you were thinking about. Getting these photographs taken without any makeup, that's going way too far. It's nonsense, dear. Anybody would look washed out." "Look," I argued, "I do think it's significant to show your readers the truth. I think that'll make them relate to this woman's plight much more. Is it not just fake to pretend that she came through her emotional and physical challenges as if she stepped out of a bandbox without any war wounds to show for it? Even the redwood trees where I grew up have battle scars on their long, powerful trunks, and it makes them even more magnificent and distinguished. For goodness sake, Heather, humans aren't trees, and no one would ever thank you for showing them their battle wounds. We're a glossy magazine, for goodness sake. We use makeup and lighting effects and airbrushing as unique tools of the trade, much like an artist uses their brush to create perfection. If we showed the people the ugly, grisly truth, I don't think our readers would be buying our glossy magazines. People want to read magazines because they love seeing beautiful people. They enjoy the images of perfection. That's what sells our magazines. It's the same for all of our competitors. It's always been that way. So get used to it, dear." "I don't understand why truth is so terrible," I protested. "Glossy magazines, Heather, is like a great work of fiction. Our desire is to get people to buy our magazines. We make everything look attractive. That's what sells, dear. Why is that so difficult to comprehend? It's called window dressing. It's used in advertisements, food commercials, cosmetic products. It's designed to make people want to buy the hamburger or the cream that will make them 20 years younger. It's all about dreams and hopes and aspirations. I just don't agree with it, I exclaimed. It robs my article of depth. How can someone who's been through substance abuse look so flawless? It just seems so wrong. Wrong or right, Heather? That's the way we do things in the magazine business. Now, I value your incredible articles, but your interfering with the photographs and makeup artists on site is not acceptable. Do you understand this? I suppose I'm going to have to, I said. If I want to keep my job, that is. Good girl, said Irma. I knew you would see sense. I walked away from my boss's office feeling like a proud party balloon that had been popped and deflated. Why did my boss think that pictures of real people and their real lives needed to be glossed over? I had written such a gripping article that was now going to be diluted and undermined by all this fake, superficial, phony glamour. I went back to my stylish Los Angeles apartment, feeling very demoralised that evening, half tempted to call it a day and throw in the trowel with my job. But I'd worked my guts out to climb the ladder and get to this prominent position within the company. I was living in a great apartment in California, and I didn't want to jeopardise my high standard of living that I'd procured through hours of hard work. Yet I did think the way the magazine glamorised, embellished and romanticised everything was intrinsically wrong, and not healthy either. It was not wholesome for the pimply teenagers to feel intimidated by pictures of flawless, perfect skin, nor the slightly overweight youngsters to be discouraged by pictures of super skinny models that would invariably make them feel inadequate by comparing themselves with fake images of perfection. Even Cindy Crawford had been stopped in the street once and being asked, "Why do you look so perfect in the magazines, but just so normal in real life, just like the girl next door?" And she had explained that gilded, dolled-up pictures weren't even real, and she was right, of course. It was after this altercation at work that had left me feeling disenchanted and reflective about everything and what I was doing with my life. I came to the wise conclusion that getting away for a few days was definitely on the cards, so I decided to pay my parents a spontaneous, unexpected, impromptu visit. I had not seen them in ages, and I fancied surprising them with my visit. I knew my parents would be over the moon to see me again. They lived in our family home close to Redwood National Forest, where I'd grown up. I knew it would be an 11.5-hour drive, and so I ensured that I left my apartment in Los Angeles at about 3:30 the following morning, to give lots of time for the journey. I set out on the long drive, ensuring that I took a few stops as possible along my way, and I'm glad to say that the journey went very smoothly, with a few hiccups, barring 1 or 2 bad traffic accidents and a few stops for snacks. It was about 4 o'clock when I finally pulled up the long paved driveway and parked outside my parents' modern ranch-style home, where I'd grown up as a young girl. It felt so great to be home. I was amazed to see no one was there to greet me, as our 2 Bergamosa shepherd dogs, Gypsy and Trooper, were not at home, as they would have bounded exuberantly towards me to greet me and would have covered me with big wet tongues. I also discerned my father's red truck was not in the drive. It suddenly hit me with a startling clear revelation that both my parents, my younger sister and my 2 rambunctious dogs were at our whimsical beach home on the Oregon coast. How could I have forgotten? I remember in passing that they'd mentioned they'd be going there for a week's break or so. Talk about really bad timing. What a bummer, I thought. I opened the house with a spare key and deactivated our alarm system while offloading my suitcase into my childhood bedroom. Never mind, I thought. I'd spend a lovely weekend at home with or without my parents. It was still so fabulous to be back. Granted, I could drive to our beach home in the Oregon coast, but I didn't fancy that extra journey. I was considering giving my family a call on my cell, but I decided against it, as I didn't want them to feel bad that they'd missed out on seeing me. I was delighted to see that at least our cat Sugar was at home, and I noticed she had copious amounts of dried biscuits and water out to last a few days. And she looked incredibly pleased to see me and greeted me with incessant purrs, rubbing her long agile grey body against my legs. Feeling rather stiff from my long drive, I decided to get back into my car and drive to the wooded forest that I frequented a lot as a young girl. It was a charming retreat that held so many precious childhood memories for me. It was full of redwood trees, rocky outcrops, and a pretty stream that cascaded through the valley. I knew that some fresh air and light exercise would do me an enormous amount of good, so armed with a water bottle and a pair of walking shoes, I got into my car and drove to the woods. As a young girl, my sister and I had called the spectacular forest that we frequented as kids Fairy Tale Grove, because that is what this place meant to us. It was full of hiking trails and the most beautiful galvanizing wooded area, easily as breathtaking and provocative as Redwood National Park itself. I began to hike up the steep, rugged and somewhat rocky open trail and discerned that there were no hikers around, but then it really was rather late in the day, and would grow dark soon. But I wasn't concerned about this prospect at all, as I fully intended to make my visit very brief, but it felt so good to stretch my legs after the long drive. These graceful, elegant redwood trees are so enormous in girth and length, towering up into the blue firmament like natural, masterful, imposing vertical skyscrapers, some that can reach 30 stories high. They possess the most colossal fire and bug-resistant trunks that you have ever seen in your entire life. I've always marvelled at the distinguishing lines of green moss growing through some of the long vertical ridges, and plenty of the battle scars with the green leaves shooting out from all sides. I love nothing better than running my hands up and down the rough texture of these ancient trees, marvelling at their size and girth. As children, we had always believed that there were colonies of fairies living within these redwoods, with vast thriving fairy cities and big magical castles. For indeed these incredible specimens, with their divine nature, not to mention the reverence that they command, is nothing short of awe-inspiring. It would seem that the huge leafy canopies that shade the wooded retreat are the quintessential ecosystem for plants and animals alike. As I began walking down the long trail of this lush, temperate evergreen forest, I made my way to the steep rocky incline, where there was a pretty stream meandering through this beautiful verdant wonderland, surrounded by some rocky crags. As I walked, I could hear the sound of pretty birdsong chirping from the canopy above my head, whilst I appreciated the pretty soft shafts of sunlight that danced through the branches onto the forest floor, dappling it in a dainty, delicate, luminescent light. Suddenly, everything became deathly quiet in the forest, as if the birds ceased their joyful tweets, and for a moment everything became ominously still. Then I was certain that I was being watched. I would say that certain is an understatement, as it was indisputable that I was certainly being watched, and the feeling was incredibly discomposing. The only way that I can describe it to you is I felt exactly like a tiny mouse trapped in a tiny hole being stalked by a very sizable, determined domestic cat. I sensed something predatory was in my midst, but who or what it was, I couldn't even imagine. The worst part of it all was that I couldn't see it, but I could sense it and feel its presence, which was unambiguous and tangible, despite being so unperceivable. I could also detect a faint odour, a smell I wasn't well acquainted with. I wouldn't describe it as hideous by any manner of means, but it was unpleasant, rather like a sweaty smell. I decided that I needed to retreat from whence I'd come, but my father's words rang in my head like a resounding bell. Never, ever run from a predator. I began to walk away, speeding up my pace, but never running. I could hear the heavy feet following me. I knew I was being stalked. I turned around but saw absolutely nothing. My heart was beating violently in my chest. I was pretty sure that whatever it was that was pursuing me was seeking cover behind the gargantuan trunks of a redwood tree while trailing close behind me. Then I saw him. A head peered at me from 8 feet off the ground from behind the vast girth of a redwood tree. I knew at once what it was. It was a Bigfoot. There was not a shadow of a doubt about this in my mind. Once the critter knew he'd been spotted by me, he glided towards me on his powerful long legs. I turned around immediately and began to run away from the critter as fast as I could, no longer heeding my father's advice. I had to escape. I had to get away from this horrifying creature. I could hear his heavy breathing behind me and almost feel his pungent, acrid breath upon my back. Let me put this lightly. I knew I was dead. Then suddenly I remembered the rocky enclosure where I would hide as a little girl, and it was my only hope. I ran towards it and squeezed behind the circumscribed space, hardly daring to believe that my body still fitted after all these years. Oh, thank goodness I was so slim. I'd only once discovered it during a game of hide-and-seek. It was a large rock that had a thin, narrow crevice that was thankfully spacious enough for a slender person to hide behind, and luckily this opening was easily as long as it was wide, but it was also exceedingly narrow. As I squeezed behind this cramped, tapered opening, I wiggled my body slowly towards its furthest point. I could hear the critter pounding angrily at the rock, but even he wasn't strong enough to break it down. Then he squeezed his hefty arm through the long compression and felt along the crevices with his hands. He was trying to find me. Fortunately, his hands ended only inches away from me. Otherwise, he could possibly have yanked me out of this confined space without much trouble. The critter was incandescent with rage and began to implode by making the most horrifying blood-curdling screams that turned my blood cold and sent shivers of dread down my spine. I just remember quivering, shaking and trembling, and even though I tried to compose my body, I could not control the involuntary shudders and shakes. I don't think I've ever experienced such incredible, inexplicable fear. Even my teeth were chattering. That's how terrified I was. I now know what people feel like in life and death scenarios. I noticed that my body literally tightened as my muscles clenched, and even my legs began to feel like heavy boulders beneath me. I knew that physically the fear had incapacitated me. I could hear my rapid breathing and the fast sound of my rising heartbeat pounding through my chest. I'd vaguely seen the Bigfoot, and all I remember is beholding the shadowy 8-foot mass of long, flowing dark hair, with a cone-shaped head and swinging overlong arms, bounding after me like a monster from my most horrifying nightmares. I could hear the critter growl. He was screaming and even pounding his chest in an act of angry defiance. I knew this cantankerous, grouchy critter was as livid and as volatile as a hot, bubbling volcano ready to spew its molten lava. I assure you that every thunderous sound he made was more terrifying than the first, and he even caused the ground beneath me to wobble and vibrate like the rumblings of an angry earthquake. I began to console myself and reassure myself by taking long, shallow breaths and talking to myself. Calm down, relax, 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 I told myself. Everything is going to be fine. You are safe. You are alive. All is well. I repeated these mantras over and over again in my head to calm my alarmed state. Before long, the dark shadows of nightfall descended over the valley, and I knew I would be spending the night in this obscure hiding place. I could hear the sounds of crickets and frogs, along with owl hoots and coyotes. The worst thing of all was no one knew I was even here. I didn't even have my cell phone handy, as in those days I never carried it around with me. This was my biggest regret at this moment. I realized with horror the critter was not going anywhere. He had parked himself outside my hiding place, much like a cat mooching and prowling outside a mouse hole, in readiness to flush it out, with a determined, unrelenting resolve. I knew he was waiting for me to leave the confines of my safe, incommodious enclosure. I sensed he had a deep hatred for human beings, and was looking to extract his lethal revenge upon our species, using me as his prime example. As the night progressed, I could hear the critter snoring loudly outside my hiding place and occasionally waking up for a while, and then he would start breathing heavily and squeezing his long hands through the opening again, as he was intent on getting to me. I just stood still, closing my eyes, trying to sleep in my standing-up position, knowing that this was going to be a long, drawn-out night, and escape would be a long time in coming. It must have been very early morning, because the whole valley was bathed in the most gorgeous soft light that twinkled through the redwood trees. There were tweets of the early morning birdsong. I could see it was very early, and hear the loud, deep guttural snores of the critter, who was curled up determinedly outside my hiding spot in a deep sleep. All of a sudden I heard this low whispering sound, and a couple of acorns were being flung at me from within my tight enclosure. I looked up to see one bright eye peering in at me through the narrow opening. But this eye looked kind, it looked concerned, it looked caring. I could hear words in my head, "Don't worry, I'm not going to hurt you." I've always wondered if I imagined them, but they were as real to me as if they'd been verbally articulated. The strange congenial critter was trying to encourage me to leave this space, but I was certain it was some kind of a horrifying trick. Once again I heard the words in my head, much more audibly this time. "I'm not going to hurt you. Come out." I have no idea why I listened to this voice, but I did, as the critter began to beckon to me. I squeezed my way to the edge of the opening, and when I saw the female Bigfoot standing there, I was in absolutely no doubt that she wanted to help me. Her energy was so kind. She pointed to the big hairy critter on the ground, and I could see that he was in a very deep sleep. But what troubled me the most was that this upper torso of his was literally covered in rounded scars that looked like he'd been on the receiving end of a hunter's rifle and had been shot multiple times, with dozens of these round scars from bullet wounds all over his body. I know now why this critter was determined to extract his revenge on me. The female critter was very quiet, indicating for me to remain very still. She gently lowered her body to the ground and encouraged me to climb on top of her gargantuan shoulders, which I did, and she glided with me as silently as possible through the sylvan towards the parking lot, where my car was parked. She obviously knew that humans accessed the car park with their vehicles. She stood there waiting for me to get into my vehicle, and I was amazed to discover that my car keys were still in my jacket pocket. I trembled violently as I climbed into my car and sat back on the seat. The Bigfoot kept turning towards the sylvan with an anxious, very disturbed look on her face. She was clearly worried that the male Bigfoot would wake up and come running after us, but all was very silent and undisturbed. I quickly started to rev up the engine and speed away. I could see the female Bigfoot in my rear window watch me leave as she glided back into the woods with such a seamless grace. I can still see her in my mind's eye all these years later with crystal clear clarity. I think she must have been about 7 foot tall, 600 pounds, and very lean and strong, with a powerful torso, a cone-shaped head, and very dark brown hair with an auburn hue. But it is her intelligent eyes and compassion that I shall never forget as long as I live. For indeed this beautiful Bigfoot saved my life. When I returned to Los Angeles, I never told my parents that I'd dropped by for a visit, because I wanted to avoid disappointing them. But my mother said, "I know it sounds strange, but when I returned from our holiday, I could swear the house felt as if you'd been around." I still work for that Glossy magazine, and I'll never agree with sugarcoating all the pages with glamorous images, but we do what we have to do to make a living. It's a very competitive world out there. I think back on the female Bigfoot I encountered with so much love, for she was a beautiful critter who stepped out of her comfort zone to rescue me. And for that I am most truly grateful. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Barron, and I was born and raised in New York City, which comprises 5 boroughs, where the Hudson River meets the Atlantic Ocean. New York is long revered for its imposing bodacious skyscrapers, much like the Empire State Building and sprawling Central. When I was about 30 years old, I moved into the fetching Park Slopes neighbourhood with my young wife Kirsten. I gather it acquired its original name from the upward sloping streets towards Prospect Park. It would seem that before the 19th century, it's hard to believe that Park Slope was initially just farms and woodland areas, until the land was divided into rectangular parcels. In the 1880s, after the development of Prospect Park, copious amounts of mansions and row houses were erected in the eastern section, which is why this area possesses that quintessential historic intrigue that was so captivating to my wife and I when we first moved here after we initially got married, as we had a huge appreciation for the character and charm of old-world architecture that, in my opinion, eclipses anything much more modern. Funny enough, I actually met my wife Kirsten on the Brooklyn subway of all things. I'd seen her standing there on that long platform on multiple occasions, and I so longed to interact with her in some way, but I had about as much courage as a puny little mouse approaching a ravenous domestic cat. There was something about this girl's enchanting energy and the way that she laughed that was so beguiling for me. I was drawn to her like a moth being attracted and enticed by a dazzling bright light. At the very best of times, I was so reticent, painfully shy, and self-effacing. I always envied and admired other dudes whom had always seemed to be able to chat up women with a seamless ease, but that was never ever my experience. I did not have the gift of the gab, so to speak. If I liked someone I met, I'd be overwhelmed by a dreadful shyness. I always reacted to social interactions like a tortoise retreating into its shell. I'd find myself hopelessly tongue-tied or at a complete loss for words. I think most women completely lost interest in me because you could have cut the awkward silence with a knife. I imagine my lack of self-confidence must have been pretty unattractive to most women. Who could blame them for that? Because your first impression of someone is often the most lasting. Of course, it didn't help that growing up my siblings were all of the male gender, and that I had attended an all-boys school. So in truth I didn't have any real experience with the opposite sex, and my greenness and naivety held me back considerably in my social prowess, so to speak, which of course was very inadequate. One day on the subway I could bear it no longer as I saw my wife standing there. Of course she wasn't my wife at the time. I just knew that I had to go up to her with all the courage that I could muster. And finally I approached her, using the lamest excuse in the book that you've ever heard. I said to her, "Your face is so familiar, I can't place you. Do I know you from somewhere?" "There's only one way to find out," she said. "Why don't you take me for a coffee?" I remember being completely floored, and I said, "Well, when would you like to go for coffee?" "Well, I'm free now," she said. "There's no time like the present." As you can imagine, the rest is history, as my wife and I fell in love, and I'd never met anyone like her before. She was humorous and funny, with an insatiable love for adventure that was so infectious, and an ardent passion for the great outdoors. Before long, Kirsten and I got married and moved into a very opulent, stylish Italianite red brick row house that had been built in the 1880s in Park Slopes. There was about 3 stories and was perfect for all our immediate needs. I'd always been a city slicker, and my wife and I enjoyed visiting quirky shops, especially the kind where you could find gifts for every single occasion. We also loved attending the farmers' market and tasting all the pickles on offer, or sampling the different local cheeses that were on display. We would often derive pleasure from taking long walks in Prospect Park and visiting some of the fabulous eateries on offer in Park Slopes, of which there were so many. I do remember a bagel place we would visit regularly where you could choose the most incredible delectable fillings for your bagels. My wife always ordered the cream cheese bagel with Oreo filling, while I preferred something much more savoury, usually with bacon in it. We had some wonderful, memorable and fun-filled times in Park Slopes. My wife began introducing me to camping holidays all around North America, and I even acquired a hunting license. Before long, I became enamoured and transfixed by the natural world. It was almost as if I'd lived in a bubble all my life in the city, and like a butterfly I was emerging from a cocoon. I was suddenly seeing the world in a whole new, voracious, fresh and vibrant light. I was discovering so many extraordinary, marvellous things about the natural world that I'd been blindly oblivious of all my life. I hankered for the weekends to get out of New York and to spend a weekend with my beautiful, fun-loving wife on another one of our incredible wild adventures, of which there were so many. It was in 2006, when my wife and I had been married for over 9 years at the time, when we decided to go camping in an area of natural forest around the North Virginia area. I would rather keep the exact location private if you don't mind. Little did I know that this outdoor adventure would change my life dramatically in ways we could never even begin to envisage, and quite literally tear my life to shreds. It all began with a pretty standard camping trip that we'd planned over a spontaneous 3-day period, when we would normally have been working in our mediocre, rather mundane pedestrian jobs in the city. I'd heard about this idyllic wooded retreat from a friend of mine who'd informed me about how exquisite this location had been for him and his wife. The mountainous terrain is very tricky, he warned me. There are lots of sheer drops and mountainous ridges, which is why it's not popular with many hikers, because it can be very precarious. But when you camp on that high elevation and overlook the incredulous panoramic views, you'll be in heaven. Kirsten and I did not need any further encouragement, and we were not disappointed. Before long I was driving my Jeep down a very rocky path, where my vehicle wobbled precariously down some of those bumpy dirt remote roads that were well off the beaten track. I discerned that there had been rain recently, as there were small pools of water within the uneven crevices of the road, causing dirty water to splash against the vehicle. Yet the recent rainfall in the area had transformed this ravishing green wilderness into an even more breathtaking verdant wonderland, and Kirsten and I were excited about this trip, and we didn't care if the ground was a wee bit damp. That wasn't going to bother us at all. We parked our Jeep in an overgrown parking bay that looked like it had not been tended to in over a decade, and armed with heavily laden backpacks, we steadily ascended uphill for several hours on an arduous, precipitous incline, which was not for the faint-hearted nor for those who suffered from vertigo, because when you looked down, you might have felt like you'd faint. We were sweating profusely and breathing heavily, despite the fact that we were both incredibly fit at the time. Before long, we discovered the quintessential camping spot, situated in the heart of the woods, that consisted of Douglas firs, European yews, hemlocks, cedars, red oaks, and celery-top pines. We found a smooth clearing large enough to put up our medium-sized tent, several yards away from the craggy rocky ridge. If you stood on the edge of this sheer drop, you would look down and marvel at the most panoramic views over the exquisite silvery lake that was fringed by the vast pyramid shapes of the mountains that rose up in the blue firmament like gargantuan, imposing, masterful giants. I noted that the idyllic, exquisite lake was flanked by a long line of Douglas firs, and these statuesque, imposing trees, along with the white fluffy clouds in the blue sky, were reflected in the shimmery, watery expanse like a dreamy mirror. This whimsical, enchanting wood green that was surrounding us was also so magical and ethereal, very dreamy, a resplendent, rich oasis of greens bathed in a twinkling, subtle light that danced through the canopy and graced the floor in a soft, dappled luminescence that was both bedazzling and beguiling. It would seem that everything, including the rocky boulders and the trunks of the trees, were swathed in velvety green moss, and the forest floor was enveloped in the delicate beauty of lacy ferns and evergreen foliage. It was safe to say that Kirsten and I were completely transfixed by this verdant wonderland. "It's so beautiful here," said Kirsten, looking over the edge of the ridge to observe the views. "I don't believe we've ever camped anywhere quite as magnificent as this," she reflected. "It's exquisite," I admitted, taking my wife into my arms and kissing her on the cheeks affectionately. "And it seems we have this wonderful place all to ourselves. It couldn't be better." "I love it here," laughed Kirsten. "We're on top of the world. We can see for miles around us." "It's treacherous here, though," I warned. "Some of the moss is very slippery, especially after the recent rain, and we are on a high mountainous ridge, so you must watch your step, because you could easily slip." "You worry too much," said my wife, giving me a gentle squeeze. "Life without risks would be very mundane indeed." We set up our camp at lunchtime, and after a bite to eat, we decided to go for another quick hike through the wood green further up the mountain, as we had suddenly regained our strength. We began to trek uphill through the sylvan, and my wife stopped me suddenly in my tracks. "Shh!" she whispered. "Listen." "What? I don't hear anything at all," I said. "That's my point," said my wife. "Everything's gone so quiet. The bird song has just dissipated. Don't you think that's strange?" "I suppose it is odd," I said, but I gave the matter no further thought, and we proceeded along our way. We continued to walk for a little while longer, and then I got the overwhelming feeling that we were being watched. It was a creepy sensation that caused the hair on the back of my neck to stand on edge, and I felt as if something was distinctly off. I was just about to express my misgivings to Kirsten when I discerned a very pungent odour on the wind that was really rather unpleasant and reminded me of cheesy trainers and stale urine. Suddenly I beheld a couple of young saplings swaying backwards and forwards, and I could see an obscure gargantuan black shadowy form moving between the trees, and I knew at once that we were in the presence of a predator. In that second my hackles rose, and my first thought that it was a bear. Then the critter surreptitiously moved a small curtain of the shrubbery with his big hand to get a better view of us. And that was when I observed the face that was 8 feet off the ground. I nearly fainted and passed out when I realised the critter was no bear. No, it had a humanoid ape-like face and very deep-set dark eyes, and it was staring at me with curious intrigue. I realised my wife had seen it too. The critter didn't growl or react in a negative way towards us, but that in no way suppressed my terror, for this daunting critter was the most threatening and intimidating beast that I'd ever seen. It really felt as if I was only yards away from something that could tear us apart, limb from limb, in a single second. I didn't know what the critter's intentions were with us, but I was certain they could not be good. It was all I could do to suppress the urgent desire to run. But running from a predator like this is incredibly unwise, and shooting at him would possibly ensure that we would never leave this place in one piece. Well, that is what I discerned anyway. "It's a Bigfoot," whispered my wife excitedly. "It's a Bigfoot!" I immediately manoeuvred my wife away from the area as I was overwhelmed with the most horrifying feeling of impending dread, and I was almost certain that we were both in terrible danger and that this critter could be trailing us. "Move," I said, pushing my wife forwards. "Move, quickly." "But I want to see the Bigfoot," she protested, resisting my attempts to move her away from the critter. "Move," I commanded her. When we got back to our camping spot, I told my wife that we should get out of there as fast as we possibly could. I did not feel comfortable about us staying with that Bigfoot loitering around. But my wife had other ideas and assured me that if the Bigfoot was a threat, it would have followed us already and shown aggression towards us, which it had not. In her opinion, it was reticent and curious. "I still think we should leave," I told her. "Why are you reacting like this?" said my wife, becoming incredibly upset and indignant. "The Bigfoot was innoxious and benign. It was possibly more frightened of us than we were of him. I think you're overreacting and being exceedingly unreasonable." "Did you see the size of that thing?" I protested. "He could have seriously harmed us." "Yes, but he didn't, did he?" "You really spoilt things for me back there," said Kirsten. "I desired to get a good look at him. I've always longed to see a Bigfoot, and now I'll never get the chance again." "Careful what you wish for," I said to her. It was with great regret that I allowed my wife to persuade me to stay at our camping site on the high rocky ridge, which in itself was more than a little precarious at the very best of times. Now, with that critter lurking around, or Bigfoot if you like, I didn't feel very safe. I gingerly decided that I'd keep a tight, prudent vigil all night to ensure that my wife and I were indeed both secure, and I sat up with my armed rifle safely by my side. I do not know why I had agreed to stay. The evening had been much more than a little stressful, as my wife was so irked with me for not letting her observe that Bigfoot. Yet aside from that minor discrepancy and our differing opinions on the Bigfoot, we still managed to have a great deal of fun, stargazing by the fire pit and enjoying a delicious steak dinner, as even the most simple things in life taste infinitely more delicious outdoors. I sat up for a long while in my tent, feeling lethargic and incredibly drowsy, while I could hear the gentle snores coming from my wife, who was now sound asleep. All of a sudden, the urge overtook me to just close my heavy eyelids just for a moment, and I must have dozed off because I surrendered to a very deep state of sleep. I remember waking up the following morning with the light streaming through my tent. Damn, I thought to myself, I didn't intend to go to sleep. How could I have allowed that to happen? I looked at the time, and it was already 9:30. I was astonished. I never normally slept in this late, but the challenging hike had clearly exhausted me. I realised that Kirsten must already be up, but I grew increasingly frantic when I called for her and couldn't find her anywhere. "Kirsten! Kirsten! Kirsten!" I called, but no answer came to me. I remember feeling sick to my stomach, like I wanted to violently throw up, because I was certain something quite dreadful had happened to her. The first thought that came to my mind was that she had been abducted by a Bigfoot. I examined the edges of our campsite, and on the soft ground several yards away from our tent, within the tree line, was something very distinctive, a fresh footprint in the mud, and it was very big. It could only have been made by a Bigfoot, and it was fresh. It must have been made during the night. Now I was beside myself with great anxiety, as I was beginning to imagine all kinds of worst-case scenarios of what could have become of my wife. All of a sudden I heard a helicopter flying overhead and distant voices, and then I looked downwards from the sheer rocky ridge and observed the most horrifying sight that to this very day sends chills down my spine. I discerned the deceased body of my wife. I knew she was deceased because that she was just a bedraggled heap that was being lifted into a helicopter and being flown away. I recognised the clothes immediately as I watched her body being placed into a body bag and loaded into a helicopter, and I was powerless to do a thing. As the helicopter flew away, I began to scream and scream and scream. I was to find out later that a couple of early morning hikers on the lower elevations of the rugged mountainous trail had decided to take a brisk early morning walk and had spotted my wife's crumpled body lying below the rocky ridge, as she had fallen from a great height. I gather they frantically called out for help, and within 10 minutes the flying helicopter's medical team had arrived to escort her away to the nearest hospital. It was sadly too late, as my wife was beyond saving, and all this buzzing activity had ensued with me being blindly oblivious, which was more than a little disconcerting and left me feeling really rather helpless. It would seem that the medical examiner hypothesized that my wife had slipped and fallen during the night over the rocky ridge to her death, as visibility would have been poor with so little moonlight. It would seem that she was found with a shattered flashlight still in her hands. I was assured by the medical examiner that no foul play was involved, and even when I suggested that my wife could have been pushed, the examiner thought such a suggestion was highly unlikely. "Look, Mr. Green, I'm not going to beat around the bush," he informed me. "I'm going to tell you as it is. Your wife had a terrible, unfortunate accident. It would seem that you were camped up on a high ridge, and that's always a big risk. There was also recently a great deal of rain in the area. I imagine she got up during the night to answer a call of nature. The light was very bad, and she slipped, lost her footing, and fell over the sheer rocky ridge. It's difficult to see where you're going in the dark. It can happen to the best of us. I assure you, in my practice, I see these kind of accidents all the time, and I do deem that your wife's accident was not suspicious. I even got my investigations to examine the site, and they assured me that the area was very slippery. They saw the skid marks, and it would have been easy to happen to anyone. It was a very sheer drop, and it's not for the first time that people have fallen from their death there. It's a very difficult spot, and I had a similar death like that last year." I'm afraid I couldn't agree with the findings of the medical examiner. I was certain that my wife was chased by a Bigfoot and fell to her death, or was calculatingly pushed over the ridge by the evil critter. I missed my wife so incredibly much. Her laughter, her bright, beautiful, cheerful smile, her huge sense of adventure. I blamed Bigfoot for her death and held him entirely responsible. The anger and hatred I felt towards him was off the charts, and like anything else I've ever experienced. A couple of years went by, and my aching grief and hopeless emptiness and despair was compounded by this dolorous sense of loss, as my wife's absence in my life left me feeling completely hollow. My former, once very happy and full earthly existence had become void of any meaning and purpose. I also felt riddled with guilt, regret, and self-condemnation. I wished with all my heart that I could turn back the pages of time and change the sequence of events as they had occurred. I would never have camped out on such a sheer drop, nor would we have remained in that location after encountering the treacherous Bigfoot. And last but not least, I should never have fallen asleep. And so began my resolute quest to eliminate the Bigfoot that we had encountered and remove him off the face of the earth, never to draw breath again or wake up to embrace another day. For Bigfoot was the cause of my wife's life coming to an untimely end, and I was determined to seek my revenge, and nothing was ever going to stop me, for indeed my mission was very, very urgent. So armed with high-caliber rifles, I frequented the area over and over again in my tireless search for Bigfoot. It would seem that much like so many of those programs you watch on television, searching for Bigfoot, I would feel like I kept drawing blanks over and over again, never with any results. I even wondered if Bigfoot had some kind of extra sensory perception and could in fact perceive when people were trying to locate him or hunt him down. Nothing would have surprised me in regards to these duplicitous, insidious and hideously evil creatures as far as I was concerned. Granted, I did come across a large footprint in the mud, and I even stumbled across an old Bigfoot nest. Yet Bigfoot I did not find, but I was still relentless upon my obsessive goal to seek out the Bigfoot and kill him, if I ever got the chance, and the sooner I achieved my mission, the better. Then one day on my hiking excursion, as odd as this may sound, I had a heightened sense that this day was going to be incredibly different. The only way that I can describe it was like a premonition or a sense of knowing. But one thing I did not perceive was that things would not pan out quite in the way that I expected them to. As I was walking through the sylvan, the bird song filled my ears with the prettiest warbles and chirps, and I observed squirrels darting up trees and 1 or 2 chipmunks crossing my path. All of a sudden, the music of the woods just switched off like a plug being pulled out of the radio. Everything went incredibly quiet, and airily so. It was like the feeling that I'd experienced once in the wood with Kirsten when we had encountered the critter for the first time. Now I was very certain that Bigfoot was around, and my eyes surveyed the sylvan with a speedy determination, much like an eagle scanning the terrain for a rabbit or a vole. Suddenly, running through the thicket towards me was a 2-foot Bigfoot, and I was unprepared for such a unique encounter, as this critter was anything but menacing, and it was so incredibly young. It stood yards away from me, scratching its head curiously, regarding me through mischievous, humorous dark eyes. It then threw a pine cone at me cheekily, and went and hid behind a tree, and was peering at me, as it peeked at me behind the large tree trunk. It was as if it was saying, "Try and catch me." I knew that this naughty thing was playing with me, and I don't know why, but I responded by throwing back a pine cone at it, and then began this curious game of hiding and throwing pine cones at each other. I began to laugh like I've never laughed before, and we played together for quite some time, and it was the first time in a long time that my face has ever cracked a smile. I stopped dead in my tracks. This was ridiculous. I was here trying to kill a Bigfoot, but this critter was only 2 foot tall and had the loveliest congenial nature. How could I possibly kill it? Suddenly I heard the sound of what I can only describe as very heavy feet thundering towards us, and that was when I saw her. It was a large female Bigfoot, and the expression on her face was very earnest and afraid, as her wide, frightened eyes regarded my rifle with grave concern, and then she studied me. It was like she was reading my very intentions and thoughts and looking right through me, wondering whether I intended to harm her and her little one, and what course of action she should actually take. I realized she knew exactly what my rifle was for, and it seemed like she didn't trust me entirely, for she seized her child in her arms very anxiously and ran backwards in the brush, all the while her steely eyes pinned on me and my rifle. If anything, she was more afraid of me than I was of her, and I'd only seen her because she'd come to the rescue of her youngling, who did not know any better than to play with me. I imagine in his innocent juvenile and inexperienced eyes I possibly looked like a small, hairless Bigfoot to a degree, and at that age the mischievous critter was just looking to play with someone. It would seem we were not really that different. Suddenly I felt incredibly ashamed as I studied my rifle, knowing what my cruel intentions had actually been that day. And it would seem that the two Bigfoots I had encountered had been anything but aggressive, and I'm quite sure that I would never have encountered them if it had not been for the bold confidence of the little one. Looking back, the female Bigfoot must have been about 7 foot tall. She was probably about 600 pounds or more, and 3 foot wide, with a V-shaped torso and pert, very small breasts that were covered with hair. I noticed that her legs appeared short and very slim, but that could have been because her overlong arms were so long that could have made her legs appear short, if you understand what I'm saying. I discerned she was exceptionally lean, with dense, sinewy muscles, and a cone-shaped head that seemingly was attached to the shoulders directly, as I observed that there was no neck to speak of. It was the human-like face of the critter that rebroadcasts itself into my mind over and over again. I remember the feminine, gentle, beautiful grey face with its soft contours, the deep-set, worried dark eyes, the flat nose, the prominent wrinkled brow ridge, and the wide, thin lips. I can see every detail of her as clearly as if it was yesterday, and she was so wonderful in every way. How could I have thought so badly of these creatures? I do remember returning home, and for the very first time since Kirsten's death, I began to sob and sob and sob, and finally it was as if a weight had been lifted off my life, and I began to heal, and I healed fast. Fast forward another 2 years, and I finally found a new love in my life, a wonderful woman called Bree. And one of the greatest ironies of all was that she was passionate about Bigfoot. She loved the creature so much, and was so mortified when I told her how I had intended to kill as many of them as I could find to extract my revenge for my wife. "I do understand," she said. "Although it is possible Bigfoot did push your wife over the ridge or scared her half to death, and then she fell, I do think the medical examiner was actually right. It was all possibly just a tragic accident. It's easy to walk out there in the dark and get confused and trip over the rocky ledge. Or maybe she could have run forward and seen a Bigfoot and got so excited, and in her excitement just slipped. You never know. All kinds of things could have happened." Imagine my surprise when one day I was having dinner in a local restaurant with Bree, and a woman came up to me and said, "I do apologise for troubling you. Do you mind if I speak to you? I'm a psychic medium." "Go ahead," I said. "Be my guest. I can't say I'm going to believe what you tell me. I'm not really into that kind of stuff, and I am deeply cynical." "Am I right in saying that your wife has crossed over to the other side?" she asked me. "That's right," I said. "Well, since I've come into the restaurant, your wife has been prodding me to come and speak to you urgently. She has a very important message for you. She tells me to tell you that it was an accident. Does that make any sense to you at all?" I nodded. "Yes, it does make sense, yes." "She tells me that it was very dark. She couldn't see at all, and the battery of her flashlight failed to work. She says she was fumbling around in the darkness like a blind man. Does that make any sense to you?" "Oh, yes, it does." "She said she wouldn't have changed anything for the world. She loves adventure, and she says stop blaming yourself for what happened, that it was her time to go. She says that she's there with your little girl." "But we didn't have any children," I said. "Well, she said that she was pregnant for about 2 months and miscarried." That's right. We did have a miscarriage." "Well, that's the baby that she's with now. She says she's very happy and she's at peace. She tells me to tell you that she loves you very much, and she approves of the two of you being together. She had something to do with you coming together." "Oh, I see. Now I must go. I'm afraid I can't have these dead people holding me up from my pizza. I hope I didn't interfere too much." "No, thank you very much. Thank you very, very much indeed. You've made me feel very good about things." "There you are," said Bree. "It was an accident. I've been praying to God that you would find out the truth in some way, and that's a direct answer to my prayers." To cut a long story short, Bree and I are now very happily married, and we have 3 marvellous children, all of our own. We still live in the Park Slope neighbourhood, but in a different house, of course. Looking back, I think maybe my first wife may have heard a sound during the night that she hoped was a Bigfoot, or it may well have been that she just became very excited and didn't know where she was going and tripped and fell over. But I no longer believe that Bigfoot was responsible for her demise. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Simon, and I'm a park ranger working tirelessly at an exquisitely beautiful North American national park, and I've been actively involved in this manner of work for many long years now. Every day has been a remarkable blessing and privilege for me. The best, most exciting and rewarding part of my job is meeting so many wonderful people from all walks of life, cultures, languages and religions from all over the globe. Granted, you do get weirdos, but on the whole, most of the people I meet on the job are really delightful, with an ardent love and passion for nature and appreciation for wildlife. For me personally, I adore working out in the open with the fresh breeze blowing against my face or the sun beating upon my brow. I would describe the national park where I work as bedazzling and beguiling, as visitors from all over the world flock here to enjoy the scenic panoramic views, the majestic imposing mountains, the rugged rocky outcrops, the undulating green valleys, prairies filled with wild flowers in spring, dreamy green forests with statuesque trees, waterfalls, streams and silvery lakes. You name it, we have it all here, along with hiking trails, horse riding trails, camping sites, and so much more. I will be keeping the details about where I work as obscure and indeterminate as possible, as one of the hardened, contemptuous rules of being a ranger is not to talk about various aspects of the job that must remain secret. There are very significant consequential reasons for doing so, of which I will not elaborate upon for obvious reasons. However, I will say that there are erroneous, enigmatic and inscrutable things that go on in our national parks that border on the bizarre and unconventional, so much so that many events remain cloaked in mystery and relegated to the realms of the paranormal or supernatural, as no explanation can be found to account for them. If my employers were to discern that I was speaking about some of these anomalous, outlandish events to you, and of course your listeners, I would more than likely lose my job. And my job is my greatest passion, and so I'm not willing to risk losing it. Growing up as a young boy, I was a pastor's son, and it was assumed that I would follow in my parents' ostensible footsteps and become a pastor at their sizable church. It would seem that over 3 generations of my family had been men of the cloth, and from a young tender age my zeal was not about the church, but all about the natural world. I remember raising some rambunctious, mischievous baby raccoons whose mother had tragically been run over and killed by a car. I would feed them every couple of hours diligently with a syringe until they became strong, healthy and robust enough to fend for themselves. I assure you they were quite a handful to raise, single-handedly, but I am glad to say they were successfully released back into the wild. I also rescued several gentle fawns over the years whose mothers had been killed by passing cars. Taking care of orphaned or abandoned animals brought me so much satisfaction and incredible joy. I can honestly say that every animal I ever rescued I bonded with on a very deep level. It was almost as if they sensed that their lives had actually been saved, and over the years I've actually received visits from these creatures that I rescued. I think what really clinched the deal for me as to becoming a park ranger was when my family visited Yellowstone National Park, and that was when I knew exactly what I wanted to do when I was older. I remember being so in awe and so enamoured by the park ranger who came to talk to my parents, and I was thinking to myself that he had the best job in the entire world, and I wanted to be exactly like him. I remember hearing my parents discussing me once. It appeared that my father was very aggrieved that I had so little interest in the church. I would hear my mother say, "Don't worry, darling, we'll pray about it. I'm sure Simon will come around to our way of thinking sooner or later and follow in your footsteps." "I'm not sure he will," said my father. I think he's completely enamoured about the idea of becoming a park ranger. I don't think we can stop him. God has clearly other ideas in mind for our son, and following in my footsteps is not one of them. And so it was one day that my favourite dream and desire was realised. I remember the first day I started working as a park ranger. I was young and naive at the time, and I could tell the senior park ranger had little regard for juniors like myself. He was looking at me very dismissively, as if he didn't think I would make it through a single day, but I knew he had underestimated how tenacious and motivated I was to make this my life's work. "I'm saying how it is, son. I don't think you have the tough stomach you need for the job like this. I've seen many youngsters like yourself come and go, barely even lasting 6 months. There are things that go on here that are not for the faint-hearted, that defy natural explanation. You need nerves of steel in this line of work. It's not just about meeting people or helping them out to their campsites and trails, ensuring that they're well-maintained and safe. There are other things in the job that are far less agreeable." "What do you mean, sir?" I asked. "You will find out soon enough, son," he assured me. "And when you do, you'll be out of here faster than I can say grease lightning." I was more than a little determined to prove the senior ranger wrong, so I knew that whatever fate had aligned for me, I wasn't going to be one of those flaky young men who quitted my job at the first sign of trouble. I did ponder what it was that he was talking about when he said that I needed nerves of steel, but I was in no doubt that I would soon find out. My first strange experience at the park happened when a couple of young female campers reported that there was a strange man loitering around their campsite that was making them feel very ill at ease. The two young women came rushing up to me when I pulled up to the site in my vehicle. They looked heartily relieved to see me and regarded me with large, frightened eyes. I could tell they were very discomposed and distressed. "Someone's been spying on us in the tree line," they told me. "We can tell that he's watching us, and it's freaking us out." "I saw him," said one of the ladies. "He went right into our tent, but the odd thing is I never saw him leave, but I did see him scuttling back into the woods. There's something not right about him. He was wearing blue jeans and a white t-shirt, and there was a blood stain on his shirt. He looked very creepy." "You saw him go into your tent, but you never saw him leave," I said, looking amazed. "Are you sure about this?" "Very sure," said the woman. "I don't understand why I never physically saw him leave, but he's no longer in our tent. But I definitely saw him walk in there. I'm certain about that. I'm very clear about what I actually saw." I immediately started to investigate the area, and I could sense something inauspicious was there, but I could see nothing. I instinctively knew that something predatory and evil was leering at me, and whatever it was, it felt menacing and menacious. But what can you do when you find nothing to account for these irrational feelings? It was incredibly disturbing for all involved in dealing with this questionable conundrum, of which nothing made any sense at all, for indeed the bodeful man causing this distress could not be located. I knew why these terrified girls were unduly alarmed, because I sensed something was incredibly wrong, but I couldn't make any sense of this illogical, nonsensical course of events upon which there was no explanation. I've always been a rational person at the best of times, and has believed that there is an explanation for absolutely everything. But on this occasion I was drawing blanks, and was nonplussed and perplexed. I walked around the grove and could clearly hear the squeaking sound of heavy feet walking behind me at a steady pace, and when I stopped, so did they. I could even smell the acrid stench of alcoholic breath being breathed over me from a distance away, but when I turned around, nothing was there. And this experience rarely rattled me, because I sensed a very tangible, haunting presence. "Who is there?" I said, looking around the wood green with my flashlight. "Show yourself now." But there was nothing. I was met by the sound of silence, and only the soft rustling of a few leaves, and the gentle breeze blowing against my face. "Who is there?" I commanded. "Show yourself now, or else you will be in serious trouble." All of a sudden something was tapping me on the shoulder, and I turned around, but no one was there. Imagine my amazement. I was completely freaked out. Nothing made any sense at all. What in God's name was going on? Suddenly one of the girls came running forwards towards me, with a distraught look upon her face, and she was out of breath. "He's back," she cried in distress. "He went right into our tent again," she said. "He's there right now, and we can hear him going through our things. Please come quickly." I immediately raced over to the tent and cocked up my rifle, because I wasn't sure whether we were dealing with a delusional nutcase or a drunken vagrant. "Sir," I commanded, "come out of the tent now." There was no answer, and the two young men looked at me with anxious faces. I peered into the tent, but no one was there. The tent looked as if it had been ransacked by a huge tornado, as it looked like a jumble sale in there, with clothes strewn all over the place haphazardly. But I thought to myself that maybe the two girls were just exceedingly messy. "No one is in there," I told the young girls, who began to shriek when they looked into the tent. "We both saw the man walking into our tent," they said. "Look, the place is in complete disarray, and our clothes are strewn everywhere. He has completely ravaged our tent. The place looks like a bomb has hit it." "Just check that there's nothing missing," I told them. "I'm only missing my yellow sweater," said the girl. The two girls were absolutely terrified. They kept looking at me for the answers and solutions to their problem, as if I was somehow the one who could save them from this inexplicable situation. I was at my wits' end as to know what I should do about the strange goings-on. I didn't know how to console the poor women, who were in a desperate state. I decided to help them hitch their tent in another location, and it would seem that the troubles that they had dissipated, and I was heartily relieved about that. I did check on them, though, all night, which was very reassuring for them. I returned to their original campsite to see if I could get a sighting of the weird man, but although I sensed the same disturbing, unsettling energy, I saw and heard nothing. I did find the yellow jumper that the girl was missing, shredded into pieces and hanging like tinsel all over a large fir tree. All of a sudden I felt this awful throbbing pain searing through my flesh on my torso region, as if someone had deliberately slit my skin with sharp nails. And then there was a faint whisper in my ear, and a husky, disembodied voice that said, "Get out!" I was so terrified that I just legged it out of there, and I knew in that moment that I had encountered something supernatural, and not of this world. I was to discover that I had 3 long bleeding scratches along my torso, and I was so frightened by this event, but I never told the other rangers about my experience, most particularly the senior ranger, who was expecting me to call it quits any day now, and I was not going to give him the satisfaction of letting him see me fall. I didn't want any of them to think that I was going to lose my bottle. On another occasion I was called out by a frantic woman who was crying inconsolably on the telephone, so I made my way to her location because I couldn't make out anything she was saying on the call. The woman was sobbing. "I watched a man on that rocky ridge over there deliberately jump to his death," she cried. "I think he fell down. I could hear his body crashing to the ground. I couldn't go over there to look. I just haven't got the stomach for it," she told me. "I'm too terrified of what I might see. I'm certain his body must be all mangled and messed up after such a ghastly fall. There's no way you could survive that." "Of course," I said, trying to calm the poor lady down. "Just you relax and take it easy," I said, trying to compose the very distressed woman. I remember my body muscles tightened and clenched, and a feeling of impending dread overtook me. I cautiously ambled over to the rocky ridge, psyching myself up for what I was about to see. I knew I was qualified and prepped for a scene of carnage like this, with blood and guts invariably spilt all over the ground. I had received intricate training about coping with this kind of situation, an off-the-cuff premeditated scenario, as there are people who commit suicide all the time by jumping off ridges, and people who accidentally fall off the mountains to their deaths. So now everything that I'd learnt, all my training, was being called into play and put to the test. And when you're faced with the grim reality of an actual event, I can assure you that one is never fully prepared for dealing with these horrendous nightmare scenarios. Well, at least I wasn't. Imagine my surprise when there were no bodily remains lying there on the ground. "Are you sure you saw someone jump?" I asked the lady. "Very sure," she said. "I even heard the body crash to the ground, and the sounds of bones breaking. I cannot forget a sound like that. It sent chills down my spine." "Well, ma'am, there's nothing there," I assured her. "I'm not making it up," she insisted. The woman looked very bewildered. "I know what I saw. I remember he looked directly at me before he jumped, and I sensed a sadness. I could feel it. I promise you it was real." The distressed, frantic woman began to search the area with me, but there was no sign of the suicidal man, and I remember her saying to me, "I know what I saw. I know what I saw. I don't understand." I know it sounds strange, but I actually believe the woman's account, because there was an oppressive feeling in that area, unlike anything I've sensed before or since. It was a wretched, hopeless feeling of despair that seemed imprinted on this place like a signature in time that could never be distinguished or erased, and many people who have been around the area claim that the spot gives them the chills to this very day. It was a year later that I actually witnessed that very same man walking across the ridge and jumping over the edge to his death. I recall feeling the depths of his pain and total despair. I cried out to him, "Stop! Don't jump!" I told him not to jump, although I knew I was seeing only his ghost and the traumatic event in time that was being reenacted again and again in our reality, rather like a video recorder being played over and over. As strange as it sounds, I was hoping that I could stop him from jumping, but my efforts were obviously fruitless. I could hear his body crashing violently to the ground and his bones breaking, but I saw nothing. I did go over to the place that he must have landed, patting the ground with my hands, and believe it or not, there was a spot on the ground that was so icy cold it actually felt like I was handling a block of ice, and the rest of the ground on the outer perimeters was warm to the touch. We have had over a dozen visitors since at the park phoning in about a suicide jumper jumping to his death, and we always tell them we'll attend to the case immediately, but we know it's just a ghost. On one occasion I got a frantic, panic-stricken call from a woman at her campsite, as she informed me that her 5-year-old nephew had vanished, and she was in a dreadful state. The hysterical, distraught woman was weeping so much that her mascara was running down her face in black streaks, and she was blubbing incoherently. I could barely distinguish an audible word that she was saying. "Ma'am," I said, "please try and compose yourself. How can I possibly help you if I can't hear a word you're saying? Take a deep breath, relax, and tell me exactly what happened." "She'll never forgive me," cried the woman. "This is the very first time my sister's trusted me to look after her kid, and now he's missing. Something so terrible has happened. I feel it in my guts." "Could you tell me exactly what happened, ma'am, and where your nephew was the last time you saw him?" "Callan was standing behind the oak tree and was answering a call of nature. I told him to be quick about it, but after a few minutes I called him again, and he'd completely vanished. He was there, and now he's gone. I don't understand what's happened," she said. "It's like he vanished into thin air. It all happened so quickly." "Look," I said, "he may have wandered off, but I'll call on extra resources, and I'll leave no stone unturned to check every area for your nephew. We'll do our level best to find him," I assured her. "Why did this have to happen?" cried the woman. "My sister will never, ever forgive me. I've been in prison for over a year, and my sister has only just started to believe that maybe I'm not a complete deadbeat loser that she thinks I am. We've only just begun to fix and repair our relationship. We never spoke to each other for over 10 long years, and now this had to happen. She'll never speak to me again, never." "Look," I said, "calm down. We'll only inform her if the child is definitely lost. At this stage, we don't know what our situation is. She need never know about this if we find him. Now keep praying. Could you just tell me exactly what he was wearing, ma'am?" It was an electric blue T-shirt and a pair of khaki pants. Before long, a search began, trying to locate the young toddler who'd been missing for a long while. I was galloping over the wilderness on my horse Ladybug, through the verdant forest area that was in close proximity to the mother's campsite, when I suddenly saw something blue catch my eye, suspended up in a large tree. My heart almost flipped in my stomach because I didn't know what I was going to see. Was this the missing boy, I wondered? I bounced off my horse and sprinted towards the tree, alerting all my colleagues to my findings. "I've found the boy," I said. "He's up the tree, but he's not responding to my calls. "Cullen," I said, "are you all right?" I could see the blue t-shirt and the khaki pants in the tree on a high branch, so I knew it was the boy. "Cullen, can you hear me? Are you all right?" The boy did not move, nor did he respond to my calls. I assure you there is no worse feeling in the entire world believing that you are dealing with the recovery of a dead body, especially when it's that of a very young child. I could feel the bitter taste of nausea rising up in the back of my throat as I pondered on what sick bastard had done this to the poor child. In a trice, backup arrived. Someone climbed up the tree to retrieve the boy, but when they brought him down, it was not the boy. We discovered someone had made a hay doll and put the boy's clothes over it and stuffed it up in the tree. This had to be one of the sickest, most insidious things I've ever witnessed in my life. I knew we were dealing with someone who wasn't right in the head, and time was of the essence if we were able to retrieve the child alive. My emotions were very mixed at this point. I was relieved that the boy was clearly not dead, but vexed as to what had happened to him. Also, I ascertained that the boy could potentially be still in very grave danger. If we didn't act fast, we may be dealing with a missing persons case that could never be solved, or the final recovery of a dead body, or a body that was never ever found. Whatever way you looked at it, things didn't look good, and the whole case left me with a nasty taste in my mouth and a dreadful vacuous feeling of hopelessness. It was confirmed by the overwrought woman that those clothes were indeed what the child had been wearing before he'd mysteriously vanished, and I had to inform her that the parents would need to be notified at once. Once again I went galloping over the immediate area with its undulating green turf, rugged outcrops, and vast areas of natural greenwood. That was when I saw this dark, shadowy creature moving towards me, as it seemingly floated with such a fluid grace, with a small bundle contained in her large, human-like hands. I was so stunned and gobsmacked by what I was seeing, it seemed so surreal. Because running towards me, not away from me as you would expect, was the elusive, evasive and reticent creature that we like to call Bigfoot, that would not normally want to be seen by anyone, and prefers to remain in the shadows. Yet this critter was waving me down, with her overlong arms, determined to get my attention. Over the years, working at the National Forest, I have heard of people who claim to have had encounters and brief sightings of Bigfoot, including park rangers that I know in person. But for me personally, I had to physically see one to believe that the critter was indeed real, because I'm a natural and born skeptic. Yet what I was observing right now in my field of vision, without a shadow of a doubt, was a majestic, lofty female Bigfoot. But it was her determination to pursue me that baffled me the most. And she was sprinting towards me with a child in her arms, whom I realized at once was the missing boy that we were looking for. The Bigfoot pointed towards the boy and pushed him towards me very gently, looking directly at me with earnest eyes and making a strange chattering sound. I watched in stupefied silence, hardly daring to believe what I was actually seeing. I stood there like a statue, frozen to the spot, not by fear, but by wondrous awe, as I watched this powerful creature gliding away, never once looking back. This all happened within seconds, as that is how fast it was. For me, it was extraordinary. All I remember was that she was about 7 foot, 600 pounds, with short legs and very long arms, V-shaped muscular torso, and a pyramid-shaped head, with deep-set, beautiful eyes that were filled with love and compassion. This Bigfoot was so human-like and intelligent, I was completely overawed by her. I immediately radioed in the ranger's office to say that the kid had been found safe and sound, and I could hear the relieved voices on the end of the line. Everybody was so happy. "Are you Cullen?" I asked the boy. The kid nodded. I discerned that he seemed very unfazed and undaunted by what had just transpired. He was wearing a strange one-piece outfit made of the oddest shimmering white material that I've ever seen. In truth, it was a strange fabric that seemed so out-of-worldly, like something that you'd expect to see on Star Trek. "Where did you get to?" I asked him. "Your aunt has been very worried about you, and everybody has been looking for you." "The lady took me," he said. "You mean the hairy lady that brought you here?" I asked, referring to the Bigfoot. "No, not her, another lady, a pretty lady with long red hair." "Where did she take you?" "I don't remember, but it was nice. She was nice to me. Did she give you the clothes you're wearing? Yes, he said. And then what happened, I asked. Well, she took me to another lady, and the other lady says I wasn't the right boy. I see, I said. And what happened next? I can't remember, but then the hairy lady with the funny face you saw brought me, when she saw me under the tree. She brought me to you. That's all I remember. To cut a long story short, the child's aunt was so relieved to get her nephew back, and it was very fortunate for her that the ranger's office had not managed to contact the boy's mother, and so she was none the wiser about what had happened to her son. I gave you the wrong number, the aunt told me in confidence. You have no idea what my relationship with my sister means to me. I just wanted you to search for the boy a little longer before she received the terrible news about her missing son. Fast forward a few weeks, and the aunt phoned me out of the blue one day. I still have no idea what happened to my nephew, she informed me, but I'm beginning to think something out-of-worldly happened to him. Nothing makes any sense to me at all. I keep thinking he might have been taken by aliens or to a parallel universe. It's all exceedingly odd. I took the fabric of the onesie that he was wearing, to the dressmaker, and she's never seen a fabric like that before. I can honestly say the aunt's phone call left me with more questions than answers about the strange things that go on in our national parks. I do, of course, have other stories to share with you and your listeners, another time perhaps. But until next time, this is my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Keith and I'm from North Carolina, which is the 9th largest state in the United States and is twice the size of Ireland. Believe it or not, it could literally fit into Texas about 5 times. North Carolina is divided into 100 counties. It extends from the coastal plains to the Piedmont and Appalachian Mountains. The exquisite Blue Ridge Mountains cover most of the western part of North Carolina, including Asheville, extending from Georgia to Pennsylvania. We are also home to the Great Smoky National Park, and we have 41 other state parks, 10 national parks, and 4 national forests here, and the scenic beauty in this part of the world is outstandingly exquisite. I was born and raised in western North Carolina, in Haywood County, in a small town called Waynesville, which is southwest of Asheville, and is situated between the Great Smoky and Blue Ridge Mountains. I really love the charming town, and have always done so since I was a little boy. It has a quintessential old-town feel about it, along with the most marvellous eateries, coffee bars, ice cream parlours, and so much more. Waynesville has a thriving tourism industry, and so many of the locals appropriate a living from its rich fruits. I gather it's been voted the best mountain town in North America time and time again, and frankly, I'm not surprised about that. I grew up amidst the idyllic serenity and resplendent majesty of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where we lived in a quaint, rustic, rather dreamy-looking wooden cabin that would not have looked out of place on a box of Swiss chocolates. For indeed, the mountainous scenery that surrounded our home was equally as magical and enchanting as the breathtaking views seen by so many viewers on the epic, legendary movie The Sound of Music, where you see the singing nun, Maria, dancing joyfully down the undulating green hills, dotted with whimsical, delicate wild flowers, singing "The hills are alive with the sound of music." For it would seem that the daily panoramic views that my eyes beheld every single morning were not dissimilar. Our resting wooden cabin was nestled in a glorious treed oasis, surrounded by sublime panoramic mountain views, rugged outcrops, meandering streams, dreamy forests, silvery creeks, and rolling valleys of green turf that were dotted with pretty wild flowers in early spring. Growing up, I was incredibly blessed to be raised in a congenial, fun-loving family home, with 2 delightful sisters and 2 devoted parents. I must say at the time I was obliviously unaware of what a privilege it was for me living in such close quarters to the natural world, as I had boundless access to the great outdoors, with marvellous camping holidays, fishing excursions, hiking adventures, horse riding, mountain biking, and ATV opportunities, and so much more. I'm afraid for a very long time I took all this for granted, not appreciating how incredibly lucky I was to live in this extraordinary place, with the fresh mountain air blowing against my face, and the easy-going pace of life here. My story that ultimately led to my incredulous Bigfoot encounter happened a long time ago in 1995, when I was about 18 years old at the time. and was really rather naive, falsely believing that I was worldly wise and invincible, as you always do when you're young. I'd always been an intrepid adventure seeker and was eager to experience life in a bustling, big, vibrant city, which was conspicuously different to my carefree lifestyle in the countryside. But I had such a hankering for something different and exciting. For an 18-year-old boy, nothing held greater appeal or enticed me more than the magnetic lure and vibrant heartbeat of the Big Apple. So it was decided that I would stay with my older cousin Barry in his New York City apartment. I was naturally eager to procure some local work in a bar or restaurant, because I wanted to live in this buzzing metropolis for a while. My parents had reluctantly agreed with this fanciful arrangement of mine before I embarked upon a degree of some kind, as at that stage of my life I was clueless as to what I wanted to become when I was older. My father thought a year or two off, living in New York for a while, might give me a chance to reflect on my life path and to make some decisions about my future. "It will do him no end of good," he told my mother. "A little maturity behind his belt will stand him in good stead. And besides, living in a place like New York will be an eye-opening, thought-provoking experience for him, which is exactly what he needs." I never realised how right my father was, as a stint in New York did inevitably help me prioritise my life. For several weeks my cousin and I were having an amazing time, but my money was rapidly burning out, as New York was an expensive place to live. I knew I needed to pay my way and realised I had to get serious about finding work. One day as my cousin and I were out painting the town red, I was stopped at random by a very glamorous 40-year-old woman in the street, who was swathed in a fetching designer outfit, accessorised with very stylish Gucci handbags and shoes. I noted that she was even more meticulously turned out than some of Manhattan's most pampered pooches. The fashionable woman handed me her glossy business card, which was for one of New York's finest modelling agencies. "You're exactly what I'm looking for," she told me. "You're tall, dark and handsome, with a really great build. How do you feel about doing some modelling work for me?" "I'm not sure," I said. "It's not really my kind of thing." "I think it just might be," she said. "That's if you're interested, of course, in being paid very well." "How much are we talking about?" I asked, growing increasingly curious, as I was looking for work in order to stay in New York, and so any job offer that wasn't labour-intensive held a great deal of appeal for me. She scribbled down some figures on a piece of paper and handed them to me. "That's what you could potentially earn," she said, "if you work for our agency, of course. Some of my prestigious clients pay very well indeed." I looked at the figures on the paper and nearly did a double take. "Are you kidding?" I gasped. "Is this for real?" "Oh, it is," the woman said, and she smiled at my bewildered, rather dazzled expression. "I take it you're interested. It's amazing how persuasive good money can be for a fine young man like yourself. This is my address," she said, tapping her card. "I'll see you on Monday morning at 9 p.m. sharp. Don't be late. We'll prepare a portfolio for you to present to my clients, and a go-see card. I'm certain they'll love your fresh, boyish look." Before long I was being paid great money and working as a model, acquiring all kinds of assignments for various clients, from aftershave commercials to designer clothes. It was not really my thing, as I didn't enjoy posing for photographs or strutting my stuff down a catwalk. Sometimes I really did feel like a prize peacock, fanning my feathers in an attention-seeking way, which, as you can imagine, I didn't really like. Yet the money was liberating, so I could financially afford to stay in New York with my cousin. My generous income meant that we were able to acquire an even more lavish apartment for ourselves, and that was incredibly cool. And, of course, it was easy money. We also had the freedom to party, enjoying the benefits of a greater social life. With a larger wallet, it meant that my normally reticent nature was a little bolder and more assertive when it came to acquiring dates with attractive young girls. Naturally, in the modelling world, I met all kinds of quirky, eccentric and unusual characters, from your no-nonsense types to the hard-working perfectionist, the arty-farty, the dramatic, the downright mad-as-a-hatter type, and for me personally, it was a colourful experience. My story rarely began as a consequence of my friendship with a gay photographer called Anton that the ladies just loved, as he was charismatic, dramatic and in-your-face kind of person. I noticed he practically called everyone "my darling." I discerned that he was gregarious, charming and expressive. He was a kind of character that was predisposed to waving his arms effusively in very expressive, effeminate gestures. He loved his audience of adoring fans, of which he had many, and he would fill you in on all the gripping, explicit details of his incredulous, tempestuous love life, which all the ladies absolutely loved. Without fail, he was always greeted by a captive audience that hung on to his every single word. I don't think he realised how hilarious he was, as even his facial expressions would have most people roaring out with laughter. He was comical, to say the least, without even trying to be. Anton wore his artificial white hair in a spunked-up, spiky hedgehog style that was very trendy at the time. I recall he told me on countless occasions that he got through a whole jar of hair gel in just 3 days in order to create this dazzling effect. "The trouble is," he said, "to look this good it costs me an arm and a leg." Anton had attractive blue eyes, framed by naturally long lashes, and he was tall and lanky, always wearing very zooty-looking zipper turtlenecks, along with tight pairs of black jeans. I noticed he was impeccably groomed and always exceedingly fashionable, with a dashing sense of style and pizzazz. I know that Annette, who ran the modelling agency, loved him to death because his quirky eccentricities made him unique and very lovable as far as she was concerned. "Darling," she would say, "what do you think of this outfit I'm wearing? I know I can get an honest opinion from you." And she most certainly could, for there were occasions he would tell her she looked hideous. Anton literally told you exactly what he thought, without ever packing any punches. "Oh, sweetheart, you look so dishy and yummy dressed like that. If I wasn't gay, I'd be drooling all over you like a dog over a fillet steak. My darling, you look smoking hot," he would say, gushingly kissing her on both cheeks. You could tell Annette was tickled pink when Anton doled out the compliments like a box of candies. Anton was unrestrained in his effusive and effervescent gushing displays of enthusiastic elucidation, and this was why people loved him so very much. One day he came into the agency looking very sorry for himself, rather like a dog with its tail between his legs, and his normally proud head was hanging very low, with his eyes focused on the ground. You could tell he looked a little like a balloon that had been deflated, as his expression was really rather pitiful. He informed everyone that his romantic relationship and love affair with his partner Caden had fizzled out and soured significantly, and it was now all over. Everybody gasped. "Over? Are you sure?" "Very sure," said Anton. "Never been more sure about anything in my life." I remember he'd been recruited to take some photographs of me for a Glossy magazine that day, but when Annette heard about his plight, she raced into his arms to comfort him, and the shoot was long since forgotten and abandoned. It would seem that Anton's emotional state took precedence over any pressing work assignment, as far as Annette was concerned. "My poor, poor darling," she said. "What happened?" "Well, I've had just about enough of that god-awful, conceited, patronising Caden," he said, "and I feel on top of the world about it. I should have ended things a long time ago." I knew, of course, he was talking about his long, turbulent relationship with the pompous photographer whom he'd been dating. It would seem his lover created photographic portfolios for a rival modelling agency. I'd never ever liked him much. He fancied himself far too much. He made no secret of the fact that he believed himself to be the finest photographer in the business. I'd often wondered why such an incongruous pair had ever got together, as they were as different as chalk and cheese. "I've always been a natural artist," Caden had boasted to me once. "I know how to create perfect lighting effects and mood, and I've won awards for my photography." I remember joking, "Well, you've certainly not won any notable awards for your humility and modesty," I said. "Well, why should I hide my light under a bushel?" he said, swaggering off. And so it was we were to learn all the intricate details of Anton's love life, for he delighted in reenacting the dramatic events, almost as if he was on a Broadway show. "This time Caden's gone too far," chided Anton. "I've had enough of Caden's inflated ego and the way he keeps undermining my work. He makes absolutely no secret of the fact that he thinks he's a superior photographic artist to me, which is a hell of a cheek if you ask me." "Of course it is," agreed Annette. "It's a dreadful cheek." Anton continued, "There is a point in time when it hits you like a brick in the head, and that's when you realise you should not be living with someone who tirelessly puts you down. He had the brass-necked audacity to tell me in no uncertain terms that my photographic shots for the competition are insipid and uninspiring compared to his unrivalled, ingenious, innovative work. He actually believes that his photographic portfolio for the competition will win him first prize, and he told me that I didn't stand a chance of winning anything because my work is so passé. "You are joking," I said. "No, I'm not," chided Anton. "He thinks he can critique my work in such a derogatory, insulting way, and I'm just going to grin and take it. And he thinks that undermining me is not going to jeopardise our relationship at all. I mean, what is he actually smoking? Relationships are built on giving, not taking all the time." He continued, "I woke up this morning and took one look at Caden, and I asked myself, Anton, what the heck did you ever see in him? Even to look at, the dude is about as bland and mediocre as a piece of boiled chicken, and he's about as riveting and interesting as a plate of steamed rice. He's got no pizzazz or any punch. Everything about him is beige." "But I thought that you thought he was the most exciting person that you'd ever met," I reminded him. "Please," scoffed Anton, waving his arms around in a gesture of defiance. "When did I ever say that?" "Well, you must have a short memory," I told him. "I recall you clearly saying that he was hot stuff." "Well, if that's the case, I must have had my blinkers on, because believe me, that dude is as dull as a drain pipe." "So when did you tell him it was all over?" I asked. "This morning," said Anton stiffly. "I told him to pack his things and leave at once. I told him I wanted him gone from my apartment when I got back, and never ever to see him again, as long as I live." "Well, what did he say to that?" "He said that he was glad that I had ended it all, because he never fancied me anyway, and that our relationship was not authentic. He also affirmed that he looked forward to getting the contract with the designer company and winning that photographic competition. He says he can't wait to see me fall flat on my face when he's announced the winner, and I can see he was smirking at me." "The nerve of it," said Annette, shaking her head in disgust. "That man has an ego the size of Manhattan. He needs bringing down to size." "What exactly is this photographic contract and competition that you're talking about?" I asked Anton. "Well, it's a designer company that's looking for an innovative photographer to promote their line of outdoor fashion, and I think my pictures are pretty damn good, let me tell you. I've produced a whole portfolio which I'll be entering into the competition pronto, and I think I stand a good chance of winning, irrespective of what that dude says." "Where did you take your photographs for the portfolio?" I asked. "Well, in the studio, of course. Where else?" "Really?" I said, raising a sceptical eyebrow. "Surely if you're promoting an outdoor range of clothes, you should be taking pictures of models in the great outdoors, against vibrant, awe-inspiring scenes of the natural world." "Well, that's what I would do." "I never thought of that," said Anton, growing rather excited. "That's actually quite a good idea." Before long, I'd persuaded Anton and another male model, including the makeup artist, to come to my hometown, as I knew a number of amazing locations where we could take some incredible shots of the natural world, from rugged outcrops to waterfalls, streams, hills and forests. "Just wait," said Anton. "Wait until I wipe the smile off Caden's face and win that prize. Everything is at stake now, as winning this prize is not just about getting that photographic contract, but it's about bringing down that little turd from his high pedestal and making him realise just how small he really is." And so it was that Anton, the makeup artist, and Christopher, the model, all visited my hometown together. I'd invited them to stay at my family wooden cabin, but they had insisted on staying at a local hotel, which I could actually understand, as Anton was so particular about everything, like the Egyptian cotton sheets on his bed, and the way he liked his steak cooked. I knew it was a huge adjustment to leave the Big Apple and visit a small little mountain town, but he was determined to outshine Caden at any cost, even if it meant breaking out of his comfort zone and getting his designer clothes snagged on barbs and covered in mud, which was more than likely to happen on one of our outdoor escapades. It was good to get home and see my family again, but the next day I had to decide upon where to take Anton for the photographic sessions. "Well, why don't you take him to the waterfall in the Sylvan?" my mother suggested. "Some of those rocky boulders are natural works of art in their own right. And as for that waterfall, it's out of this world. A backdrop like that would most certainly give him an advantage of winning that competition, if you ask me." The following morning I met Anton, who was still wearing his white bathrobe when I arrived to pick him up for the photo shoot. He was in no hurry to get started and was promptly ordering himself a champagne breakfast with smoked salmon, caviar and scrambled eggs. He was being waited on hand and foot by the hotel staff there, who were seemingly delighted to do his every bidding, and I could see why. Anton was waving around generous dollar notes as tips for them. I noted how good he looked in his lavish, opulent-looking hotel room, as he seemed so at home in the lap of luxury. Christopher and I were going to model this vast range of very stylish outdoor clothes from the designer company. The makeup artist worked on our faces to brighten our skins, creating a very natural look. Soon we left the hotel, and armed with a large suitcase of very zooty, stylish designer clothes we could change into, along with Anton's cameras, of course, we finally left the quaint little town behind us and drove into the heart of the remote, rambling countryside, where we took several turnings down some rocky, rather precarious roads, while I directed the way, as I knew the area around here like the back of my hand. I could tell by Anton's expression that he'd never driven down roads that caused the car to wobble and jolt like this before, and despite my very best efforts to persuade him to wear something more practical for the great outdoors, Anton was dressed to the nines in his meticulous designer gear. I knew that I could not persuade him otherwise, and so I didn't even try. I had become all too well aware of the eccentricities from the quirky, unconventional characters that I had encountered in the modelling world, and I knew better than to try and challenge them. Anton was an incredible artist with a keen eye for beauty, and I do believe I actually heard him gasp as we walked through the Sylvan. I can't say I was surprised. He was in awe of the scenery and completely transfixed and mesmerised by it. "Oh my word," he kept saying, "this place is so idyllic, it's so magical, it's a dream. I can't believe places like this actually exist." I remember feeling incredibly proud, rather like a mother hen over her chicklets. I realised I was very prideful of my hometown, along with all the exquisite scenery that she boasted. Indeed, the Sylvan was absolutely spectacular. There are no words to describe it. It was full of statuesque birch trees with their distinguishable pronounced white bark, along with 300-year-old red maple trees that are a sight to behold, as well as western hemlocks, dogwoods and oaks, and some of the trees with their voluptuous shapely trunks were carpeted in rich velvety green moss. The light from the shaded forest canopy danced through the branches with a subtle luminosity, enhancing the tranquil ambience of this breathtaking place. The steep, rugged, rocky mountain ground was lined with hiking trails and sculptural-looking boulders that were gloriously swathed in Spanish moss, while the brush consisted of sweeping ferns, thyme, sweet woodruff, and so much more. I think the three of us felt as if we'd been transported to a magical, mesmerising treed oasis where the sounds of the pretty bird song literally serenaded us. We spotted a couple of cotton-tailed rabbits bobbing around and several squirrels darting up trees, eyeing us with wide, curious eyes. Before long we could hear the sounds of the waterfall cascading down the masterful, elevated rocky outcrops, and as we approached this stunning paragon of nature, I could see tears of wonder pouring down Anton's face, as he was completely beguiled and bedazzled by this verdant wonderland. "I don't think I've ever seen anything more beguiling than this place," he told me, opening up the suitcase to get out some of the clothes that we were required to model. Anton set to work, taking hundreds of photographs of us, modelling these designer clothes against dazzling scenic backdrops. And even if I say so myself, to date I have never seen more incredible fashion photographs. All of a sudden I got this overwhelming sensation that we were being watched. I could tell that Anton was feeling it too, as he kept looking around the enclave nervously. "I feel as if some creep is watching us," he finally told me. "I've been feeling it for a while now." But we all looked around and saw absolutely nothing, but were greeted only by the usual sounds of the forest. During our tea break, we decided to explore the Sylvan further, leaving our stuff by the waterfall, and that was when we discovered this large tent-like structure that was made out of timber beams, neatly stacked tightly together, and was the size of a four-man tent. This curious construction had been created meticulously with fastidious attention to detail by proficient hands, that was clear. I immediately thought that it must belong to some wild local man who lived off-grid, and my thoughts were confirmed to me when I saw the fire pit outside the timber tent, lined with large boulders and strewn with the ashy remnants of a recent fire. I peered inside the tent and saw 3 very large mattresses made up of soft grass and lined with animal pelts. I also discerned these weave baskets lying on the tent floor, overflowing with plums, apples and blueberries. "Who lives here?" asked Anton, looking at me curiously. "I've no idea," I said. "I've never seen a tent like this before. It must be some kind of a man who rebels against the town and enjoys living in nature." "Let's get back to the waterfall to continue the shoot," suggested Anton. As we approached the waterfall, we all stopped dead in our tracks, hardly daring to believe what we were perceiving. For never in my wildest imaginations would I have expected to see what I was observing now. We discerned the distinct silhouettes of 2 sizable creatures, with their backs facing away from us. My first impression was that these critters were bears, but I knew that that wasn't the case, as the critters had long, agile fingers and were squatting down on bent knees, so it was difficult to perceive exactly how big they were. I could sense the excited, inquisitive energy as the critters ransacked our things, studying everything with a vibrant curiosity. All of a sudden, one of the critters stood up with effortless grace as he gripped Anton's camera, which looked like a toy, it seemed so inconspicuous and small in his huge hands. The critter turned around to face me, looking at me directly through his deep-set dark eyes, and it did not seem at all as if he was discomposed or even stressed by our presence. In that moment, I have never felt so much paralyzing fear as I did just then. I was standing literally yards away from an apex predator. This critter was easily 9 foot tall, 800 pounds and 4 foot wide. He was covered with long flowing dark hair with red, brown and blonde highlights. He was powerful, majestic, lofty and strong, so much so that I was completely intimidated and abashed by him. In that moment I knew without a shadow of a doubt that I was staring at Bigfoot himself, and I tried my level best to avoid eye contact with him, but I was seemingly locked in a trance-like state with the critter that I was powerless to escape. I wanted to run, believe me I did, for indeed I've never wanted to run so much in my entire life, but it seemed that I could not. My muscles were not operational, and I was frozen to the spot rather like a marble statue. I began to quiver in fear because my whole body began to just shake involuntarily. The critter just stood there staring at me on a continuous basis. It was like he was looking into the very depths of my soul, and I was quite afraid of what he was seeing or perceiving. I'll never forget those dark brown eyes and the intense way that he looked right through me as long as I live. The other critter, who'd been ferreting through the clothes, got up and turned around to look at us, and to my absolute horror he was even more bigger and daunting than the first critter. I noticed that he had tied a long pair of trouser pants around his middle, almost like a belt, which he kept glancing down at to admire with a very satisfied look on his face, as he had found something that he could wear and seemed terribly pleased about it. He kept making these happy chuckling sounds and stroking the long pants with his hands, as if marvelling at the fabric. I watched in awe as he glided over to his friend, almost as if he was floating on a cloud, as his movements were so incredibly fluid. Soon there were 2 pairs of eyes staring at us for what seemed like a perfect age, but it was possibly only a few seconds. But time has a remarkable way of lengthening quite dramatically when your life is flashing before you, and you're certain that it is about to be literally snuffed out in any given second, which is exactly what I thought. As the Bigfoot grasped the camera, he moved towards me. I was certain that I was about to be killed. I truly thought he was going to lash out at me, but instead he just handed me the camera in a nonchalant way, which I took from him. He studied me earnestly through inquisitive eyes, and then spoke in some strange words in a language that I've never ever heard before, and I wish I knew and understood what he was saying. I said nothing, and the critter repeated the words again, and I realised that it must be some kind of a question. I had no way of answering, so I just nodded my head profusely and said, "Yes, that's right." And then, as if on cue, Anton also nodded his head and said, "Yes, that's right," in unison with me. The critters looked at each other for a moment and then nodded, seemingly satisfied with our response. Then, to my amazement, they just glided away with such a seamless grace, never even glancing towards us once, but both eagerly engaged in an excitable conversation where they kept chatting away backwards and forwards to each other, and I knew that they were discussing us, the camera, and the clothes in great detail. I don't know if you've ever been to Madame Tussauds before and seen the statues there. Well, that is what the three of us were like as we stood frozen for several long minutes, not daring to move a muscle or even saying a word. But it was Anton who bravely broke the long silence. "What the heck were they?" he said, his voice trembling and shaking. "I think it was a Bigfoot," I said. "Well, I think they were both Bigfoots." "Let's get the hell out of here," said Anton, shaking like a leaf. "Look at my hands," he said. "Look how they're quivering. I've never been so freaked out in all my life. Did you see the size of those things? They could have eaten us for breakfast without any problems." "No, they wouldn't have," said Christopher, interjecting. "They were very nice critters and very interested in your photography. That's why they asked you if you liked taking those pictures." "They didn't ask me anything," protested Anthony. "They didn't even speak English, for goodness sake." "Well then, why did you say that's right?" protested Christopher. "You answered them." I knew he was asking a question, but I didn't know what he was actually asking, I said, looking at Christopher in amazement. "How on earth did you know what they were saying?" It was like I could audibly hear the words in my head without them being physically spoken. "I thought you could too, by the way you answered the question." "How do they even know what a camera is?" I asked, looking perturbed. Christopher shrugged his shoulders. "They seem to be able to read energy," he said. "They knew what the camera was. They were very excited about it." When we returned to the hotel, we discussed what we'd seen, and I realised that at least two of us had felt unable to run. We sensed that our fear had completely impeded our ability to move, and that we'd both felt certain that we were going to die, as we sensed these Bigfoots were indeed powerful predators. However, Christopher felt very different. He wasn't even afraid for a single moment, nor did he ever fear for his life. He said he sensed the creatures were gentle and kind, and that there was nothing to be afraid of, despite their great size. Looking back, I don't believe the critters intended to harm us at all. I believe they had observed us taking photographs during the fashion shoot, and were driven by curiosity and intrigue, which is why they examined our things when we went off for our walk. I believe the tent structure we discovered belonged to the critters, and it is clear to me that they wove those fruit baskets and are clearly capable of making a fire. I think they have human origins and ape-like DNA because they're the embodiment of those two DNA profiles, and I'm in no doubt that they were discerning and emotionally intelligent. Anton, who'd never heard of Bigfoot before, truly believes that even Arnold Schwarzenegger's body in his prime never compared to the awesome physiques of these masterful critters. Fast forward to several weeks, and Anton told me that he won that photographic contract with a designing company for their outdoor range of designer clothes, and at the awards ceremony they described Anton's photographs as the most beguiling and awe-inspiring photographs that they had ever seen. I cannot say that I'm at all surprised, because his scenic photography was sensational. Apparently Caden was so furious that he stormed away from the awards ceremony in a huge huff. It seemed like he'd really been brought down to size. "You should have seen the expression on his face," said Anton, laughing. "He was mortified he hadn't won. He couldn't believe it. I think he wanted the ground to swallow him up because he felt really small and embarrassed." "Good," I said. "You deserved to win that contract." "Well, it was worth my while," Anton told me. "Without question, encountering that critter called Bigfoot was the best and most terrifying day of my life, both at the same time. And it's down to you that I won this competition, because it was your idea in the first place. I did get a couple of pictures of Bigfoot's feet when he actually clicked the camera, he told me, but unfortunately they never came out. What a dreadful pity that was. All these years later, I'm married and still live in my hometown, and my time spent in the Big Apple really helped me to appreciate my tranquil country life, and I work here now in the manufacturing industry. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.